Book 11, Chapter 3 of Round the Block by John Bell BOUTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Overtop finds a sensible woman. Next morning, Mr. Wesley Tiffles, after an inexpensive breakfast at a cheap restaurant in Chatham Street, set out on his mission of goodness. He was reduced to his last dollar, but felt opulent in the possession of his diamond breastpin, that tower of moral strength to the borrower. He whistled as he walked, and thought what would be the best name for the new patent window fastener of the future. Union, American, Columbian, Peoples, Washington, Ne Plus Ultra, and a score more were turned over and rejected. Finally he settled upon the Cosmopolitan window fastener, meaning that its destined field of usefulness was the whole civilized globe. Patents for it could be and should be obtained in England, France, Germany, Russia, and Spain. While Wesley Tiffles was taking this rosy view of the Cosmopolitan window fastener, he stumbled upon Fayette Overtop, Esquire, who was walking briskly toward his office, and thinking over a hard case in which his services had been secured the day before. The firm of Overtop and Maltboy had recently come into a small but paying business in this way. The release of Marcus Wilkeson was generally supposed to have been effected, not by his innocence, but by the skilful and professional, but unprincipled efforts of his legal advisers. Their name was not unfavorably known among the thieves and murderers of the city, and several individuals belonging to those classes of society resolved to employ them when they got into their next little difficulty. And, since the inquest, another thing had greatly contributed to the prosperity of the firm. We allude to the case of Slapman versus Slapman. This was an action for divorce, with alimony, brought by Mrs. Grazella Jigby Slapman against her husband, Ferdinand P. Slapman. The ground upon which the separation was sought was the continual brutality of Mr. Slapman toward his wife. It was the law and the custom, in cases where both parties to the action were agreed to that arrangement, to turn over this species of litigation to a referee, who took the testimony in private, heard arguments of counsel, and rendered a decision subject to the confirmation of the Supreme Court. The court had issued a standing order prohibiting all persons from publishing, except with the consent of the parties to the action, any further reports of the cases than a simple announcement of the decree, as confirmed by the court, for or against a divorce. This order was put forth to protect the public from the contaminating example of matrimonial infelicities, though we are not aware that the number of divorce cases has materially decreased, or the standard of public morality been greatly elevated in consequence thereof. The case of Slapman versus Slapman was on trial before a referee, by mutual agreement of the parties. The newspapers did not report it, but some of them kept hinting at it in an appetizing way. The gentleman whose gallantry, etc., was the remote cause of the action was described as a rising young lawyer, who distinguished himself in a recent inquest before Coroner , the thrilling particulars of which are still fresh in the minds of our readers, or as a young ornament of the legal profession, whose office was not 100 miles from the corner of Broadway and Street, the precise location of his office. One paper went so far as to say that the triumph which this disciple of Cook had achieved in the late cause célèbre was only to be equaled by his invariable success in affairs of the heart, etc., etc. All this caused Fayette Overtop's name to be known by thousands of people. Persons who were seeking divorces reasoned, strangely enough, that a man whose gallantry, etc., was the cause of a divorce, could materially assist them in severing the matrimonial bonds. Therefore they began to flock to him. He already had 5 female and 2 male clients of this description. When Tiffles stumbled against Fayette Overtop, he at once invited his friend to go with him to Mrs. Crull's. His legal knowledge, of which Tiffles, in common with the public, was beginning to have a high opinion, might be of some service. Overtop had been told by Marcus Wilkeson of the previous day's transactions, and of Wesley Tiffles's intended visit to Miss Minford, and he at once consented to accompany him. On their way to Mrs. Crull's, whose residence had been ascertained from the directory, they passed Miss Pillbody's select school. Tiffles suggested that it would be well to call on that young lady, and pick up some intelligence of Miss Minford. She might still be receiving lessons from Miss Pillbody, and might, possibly, be in the house at that moment. Overtop also thought it would not be a bad idea to call there. He had heard much from Marcus Wilkeson in praise of Miss Pillbody, especially of her sensible qualities. Being still in the active pursuit of a sensible woman, he was moved with a real curiosity to see her. The servant showed the 2 callers to the speckless little front parlor, and a minute afterward, Miss Pillbody, looking fresh and neat, her narrow collar white and smooth, and every hair of her heavy brown tresses in its place, made her appearance. Miss Pillbody entered the room in that noiseless sliding way which indicates a constitutional diffidence. Her eyelids involuntarily contracted, so that she might see her callers on a near approach to them. Fayette Overtop, marking her modest demeanor and her short-sightedness, immediately announced his name and that of his companion, and the object of their visit. At the mention of his name, Miss Pillbody started. She had heard of Fayette Overtop, Esquire, through the newspapers, as counsel for Marcus Wilkeson, but not as the philosophic friend of Mrs. Slapman. In reply to questions about Miss Minford, she stated that that interesting young pupil had not taken lessons from her since the death of her father. Miss Pillbody here indulged in a little artifice. She produced a memorandum book, to see when Miss Minford took her last lesson, and, in order that she might read distinctly, drew out her eyeglasses, and adjusted them with a graceful movement of the arm and hand. Overtop thought that she handled the eyeglasses in a most ladylike manner, and that, when they were astride of her shapely nose, they became her face wonderfully. When Miss Pillbody had referred to the little memorandum book, she gave one short look at Fayette Overtop. That gentleman, conscious that his face was scrutinized, looked at the wall. Miss Pillbody stole but one glance, and then shut the eyeglasses prettily, and stuck them into an invisible pocket of her waist. She had come to the conclusion that Mr. Overtop was a person of dignified and intelligent appearance, and Mr. Overtop had settled into the opinion that Miss Pillbody was a near approach to that imagined paragon, a sensible woman. Mr. Overtop was about to make a shrewd remark upon the great superiority of private select schools over all public institutions for the education of young ladies, when Miss Pillbody rose. "Do you desire any other information, gentlemen?" said she. "No, I thank you, Miss Pillbody," returned Overtop, who interpreted her question to mean that a pupil was waiting for her somewhere, which was true, for Mrs. Gipscon, a fat lady of 48, was taking her second grammar lesson in the back parlor. The 2 callers seized their hats. "Could I entrust you with a message for Miss Minford, Mr. Overtop?" "With 1,000," said that gallant man. "Please, then, give my love to her, and ask her to come round and see me." Mr. Overtop would have said that he always found it difficult to carry a lady's love to another without keeping some himself, but then he thought that this might be a little bold for a stray caller, so he answered, "With pleasure." The 2 visitors bowed, and Miss Pillbody bent her head gracefully toward Mr. Overtop. "What do you think of the schoolmarm?" asked Tiffles, when they had got into the street. Overtop did not like the phrase schoolmarm. "I think Miss Pillbody," said he, "is a sensible woman." Book 11, Chapter 3. Book 11, Chapter 4 of Round the Block by John Bell BOUTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Innocence on a slippery road. Walking with the nervous and unreasonable quickness of city men, they soon arrived at Mrs. Crawle's. The good lady was sitting at one of her front windows sewing. As she looked into the street, her face was seen to have a sad and thoughtful expression. She came to the door in response to a sharp ring by Wesley Tiffles, who was tentative of bell pulls. Mrs. Crull kept 2 servants, but she could never get over the impulse to answer the door when she was near it. Overtop explained that they were desirous of seeing Miss Minford on important business. "The poor dear child!" exclaimed Mrs. Crull in a broken voice. "She is not here." "Not here!" cried Overtop. "Where is she, then?" "I don't know, sir, and that's what troubles me so." Here the good Mrs. Crull began to twitch about the mouth, but she did not cry. She had too much of the masculine element for that. Her whole life was a struggle between the weakness of her feminine body and the strong self-control of her manly soul, in which the latter, after an effort, always came out victor. Mrs. Crull then proceeded to explain, a little incoherently, that she had taken Miss Minford to her house, the day after the murder, and had asked the poor child to live with her, to be her adopted daughter. Miss Minford had gladly accepted the offer, and had stayed there until yesterday. During the last 2 or 3 days, she had noticed that Miss Minford, or Pet, as she always called her, was worried about something. She would not tell Mrs. Crull what was the matter, but Mrs. Crull somehow guessed that it was a love affair. She remembered the handsome, dissipated young man at the inquest, and she had seen him standing at the corner below her house only 2 days before Miss Minford left. "Left!" exclaimed Overtop, jumping at a conclusion. "Then that villain has abducted and ruined her." "It's bad enough, I fear," continued Mrs. Crull, "but perhaps not so bad as that 'ere. Anyhow, I hopes not. I spoke to Pet about that young man, and she looked as innocent as a spring lamb at me, though she kind o' blushed when she denied having met him since the trial. And, to do her justice, I don't think she had met him then, though I sort o' suspect she seen him from the window 2 or 3 times. She had a habit of looking out o' the window, and that he contrived to have a talk with her somewhere and somehow, the day before she went away. And I think he must have had the cheek to come into this very room" (Mrs. Crull had shown her visitors into her front parlor), "because one o' my servants says that she heerd a strange voice in the entry, and the door shut as if somebody had gone out. When she come into the entry to see who it was, she saw Pet hurrying into the parlor, and heerd her humming a tune. Pet wasn't in the habit of humming tunes, and the servant thought that rather 'spicious. So do I. Not of any wrong, mind you. I wouldn't believe that till it was proved. But, to make a long story short, here is the note that poor Pet left on my dressin' table." "Read it." I haven't got my spectacles." The truth was, that Mrs. Crull's eyes were filling with tears, and she could not have read the now familiar lines on that little piece of paper, even with the powerful aid of her spectacles. "Monday evening. Dear Mrs. Crull, please pardon me for what I have done. I knew you would not consent to it, and so I did not tell you. I was afraid I should become a burden to you, though you are too good-hearted to say so. I have a nice place, and am earning my own living honestly. Do not try to find me, but believe I will always be good, and worthy of your love, and, some day, will repay you for all your kindness. With love and respect, Patty Minford." "A very strange note," murmured Overtop. "Young girls are not apt to complain of being burdens, or to take such misanthropic views of life. There is a man's hand in this. That wretch, Van Quintem, Jr., without a doubt. Did you never warn Miss Minford against him?" "Once," said Mrs. Crull, with a faint choke in her voice. "I had noticed his glances toward her at the inquest, and I told her he was a bad young man, and she must not allow him to speak to her in the street, and that if he should come to my house to see her, I should shut the door in his face." "And what did she say to that?" "She said all she knew about him was that he had saved her life once. She couldn't forget that. Then I showed her how improper it was in him to hide his own name from her, and what horrid holes these gambling dens was which he goes to. I also pinted out how unfeelin' his conduct was to his poor old father." "And what did she say to all that?" "She nodded her head, and said, 'Yes, so it was.' But I see now that all my talk didn't make no impression on her. The sum of it is," said Overtop, "that she loves this worthless vagabond, and knew that you would not permit his visits to your house. Therefore she has left you." Mrs. Crull was a woman of firmness as well as affection. She regretted that her opposition to this young man should have been the means of driving Pet away, but she knew that she had done what any prudent mother would have done for her own child. "I'm sorry it has come to this," said she, "but I did it all for the best, Heaven knows. Gentlemen, we must find this child. But how?" Tiffles, being a man of infinite expedients, and accustomed to solve problems for himself and everybody else, at the shortest notice, answered at once. "Not by advertising for her, or putting the police on her track. Young Van Quintem would take the alarm, and move her out of town. She will go anywhere with him, if I mistake not, until she finds out better. Have you no clue to her whereabouts? Or can you think of any one that could give us any information?" Mrs. Crull reflected. "Unless I am much mistaken," said she, "I saw that tall, clean looking boy, Bog, I believe they call him. You remember him at the inquest, walking on t'other side o' the street, 2 or 3 times since Pet come to live with me. He looked sideways and kind o' sheepish at the house as he passed. I've a notion that he was a lover of Pet's too." "He's the man, or boy, for us," cried Tiffles. "Is in the bill posting business, and knows the town better than I do, if anything. A shrewd fellow, judging from his looks; and if he's in love with Miss Minford, then he's sure never to tire of hunting her up. He must disguise himself, and find young Van Quintem, and follow him day and night, till he brings up at Miss Minford. That's the shortest road. When Miss Minford has been found, then we will consider what is to be done next." Mrs. Crull and Overtop at once approved of this plan, and no time was lost in putting it into execution. Book 11, Chapter 4. Book 11, Chapter 5 of Round the Block by John Bell Bouton. This recording is in the public domain. Bog's Open Sesame. Bog was easily found, and gladly consented to do the work allotted to him. It was agreed that he should conduct the search alone, and in his own way, but that, after he had succeeded in tracing Miss Minford to her place of concealment, he should send word without delay to Mrs. Crull, and also to old Van Quintem, whose advice upon the subject had been obtained. It was thought that the reasoning and entreaties of the two together would win back the poor girl from the path of danger which she was unconsciously treading. Bog disguised himself by putting on his old discarded working clothes, and, as he looked at his reflection in the glass, thought how much truth there was in the maxim that "fine feathers make fine birds." "Go, my good boy," old Van Quintem had said to him, in faltering accents. "Go among the gambling houses and other dens of infamy, and you will surely hear of my son." Acting on this advice, which confirmed his own opinion, Bog proceeded to visit the gambling houses on Broadway. Child of the city as he was, he knew the locations of them all. His constant travels about town day and night had made him a master of all this knowledge, and much more of the sort, which is only useful when, as in the case of this poor orphan boy, it serves to show where evil must be avoided, not sought. Thus the pilot, taking his vessel through Hell Gate, profits by his knowledge of the rocks and the shallows to steer clear of all dangers, and comes safely into port. Bog, before leaving his shop, had been provided with this decoy note, written by the ingenious Wesley Tiffles, in cunning imitation of Miss Minford's handwriting. The long, elegant curves, and all the delicate peculiarities of her chirography, taught by Miss Pillbody, had been copied from the sample furnished by her note to Mrs. Crull. It ran as follows: "Mr. Van Quintem, dear Sir, come to me at once, for I am in trouble. Pet." The plan Bog's contrivance, all this was to inquire at the gambling houses where Mr. Van Quintem, Jr., was most likely to be, and, when he was found, to send this note in to him by a servant. Bog, having delivered the note, was to withdraw to the sidewalk, lie in ambush till young Van Quintem came out, and then follow him to Miss Minford's retreat. There he was to wait, and send a swift messenger to Mrs. Crull and old Van Quintem. It was not known that young Van Quintem had ever seen Miss Minford's handwriting, but, to make the game sure, the note had been written with a skill worthy of a counterfeiter, or that most dexterous of penmen, young Van Quintem himself. Bog commenced operations about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the hour when the gambler and debauchee, who have been up all the previous night, are ready to begin their feverish life again. He first visited a snug establishment near the lower end of Broadway. It was situated in the second story, over a nominal exchange office, and was the favorite resort of down-town brokers, who, having gambled on Wall Street till the close of business hours, dropped in to flirt with fortune an hour or two before going home to dinner. Sometimes their hour or two was protracted to 6 o'clock next morning, when they staggered home to breakfast and a curtain lecture together. This temple of Pharaoh was never impertinently molested by the police, and it was a subject of remark, among people who thought they had been robbed there, that there was never a policeman within sight of the door. In the hallway of the second story occupied by this gambling saloon were a number of doors, which the experienced eye of the boy at once decided to be blinds, or, in other words, no doors at all, but only imitations. The appearance of the second story was that of a suite of unoccupied offices. Whoever rapped at these blind doors could obtain no admission. At the end of the hallway, Bog came upon a long window, which was painted white on the inside. He saw at a glance at the grooves of the lower sash, that it was often raised. There was a boot-worn hollow on the floor beneath the window. The unusual length of the lower sash, and the nearness of the sill to the floor, would permit persons to step into the room easily when the window was raised. Bog rapped thrice at this window. He had a vague idea, derived from reading perhaps, that 3 raps were an open sesame to mysterious rooms the world over. The last rap had not ceased to vibrate on the pane of glass, when the window was suddenly shoved up, as if by somebody waiting on the other side. A negro of intense blackness stood revealed. He took a hasty inventory of Bog's old clothes, and then said, "Clare out, now." He commenced to close the window. "I was told to give you a $half," said Bog, bethinking himself of a powerful expedient, "if you would find out whether Mr. Van Quintem was here, and hand him a letter." The negro's eyes dilated, and his thick lips wreathed into a grin. "Mr. Fan Squintem? A little feller with a big black mustache? I knows him. Dunno whether he's in. 'Ull see fur ye." The negro paused. The interrogatory, "Where's your $half," could be plainly seen in his great eyes. "Here it is," said Bog. The negro grinned with satisfaction, pocketed the coin, disappeared through another door, from which there exhaled an odor of cigars and mint juleps, and returned in a minute with the intelligence, "He ain't in, mister. Perhaps you want to leave some word for him?" Bog had no time to lose. He said, "Nothing partickler," and hurried off, leaving the negro to puzzle over his $half. At the next gambling saloon, near the junction of Broadway and Park Row, Bog simplified his method of operations. Before making any inquiry of the servant who answered his triple rap, he thrust a $half at him, and then put his question. This plan saved surly looks and explanations. Mr. Van Quintem was a well-known patron of the establishment, but had not been there for a week, which was rather strange, the man politely added. Bog continued his search, walking as fast as he could. In second stories, in third stories, in fourth stories, in the rear of ground floors, in 1 or 2 basements, among all the more fashionable gambling dens, which at that period lay between Fulton and 10th streets, he picked his way. His new system had drawn heavily upon his stock of loose silver, and he had but 2 $half left. The question now was, how to spend them; for Bog knew of no more resorts of gamblers on Broadway, and there were none on any of the side streets which a man of young Van Quintem's style would be likely to frequent. It was the edge of evening. The boy walked up and down between 10th and 14th streets, thinking what it would be best to do next. He kept a sharp lookout at the passers-by, hoping to see the object of his search. He paused to rest himself a few minutes in the doorway of a photographic gallery, and while there observed 2 young men, with sickly complexions and bloodshot eyes, coming up the street. He recognized them as young men whom he had often seen issuing from gambling places in the small hours of the morning. They were talking briskly, and Bog pricked up his ears. "The very devil's in the cards lately," said the whitest faced of the 2. "Luck must have a turn," said the other. "By ," with a horrid oath, "suppose we try Van's." "Van's? Where's that?" "Why, the concern just opened on the corner above. The biggest kind of suppers there, they say." "All right," said the other wearily. "We'll try Van's." Van is a common prefix of names in New York, but Bog needed no further assurance that this Van belonged to Quintem. The opening of a new gambling saloon under his name, with some wealthy backer furnishing the capital, as is usually the case, would explain why young Van Quintem had not been seen at any of his old haunts on Broadway for a fortnight past. Bog followed his guides at a short distance. After proceeding 2 squares, they stopped in front of a stylish old mansion, and, after a furtive look up and down and across the street, ascended the steps, and opened the door. As they did so, Bog swiftly passed the house, and saw that a muscular servant stood within the entry, for the obvious purpose of preventing the intrusion of persons not wanted there. The large diamond breastpins and depraved faces of the 2 young men were their passports, and were viséd without hesitation by the diplomatic attendant. Bog took a $half in his hand, advanced to the door, which was now closed, and boldly opened it. The athletic guardian of the place, being confronted with this audacious youth in old clothes, put on a commanding look, and said, "Well, sir, and what the devil do you want here?" "Only to give you $half, as I was told to," said Bog, "and to ask if Mr. Van Quintem was in. Note from a lady, sir, that's all." Bog winked. The servant smiled, and took the coin. "He's in," was the reply. "Then please hand this to him, and say as how it's important. No arnser wanted." The servant received the note, and sententiously remarked, "Consider it done." Whereon the boy Bog hurriedly retreated, and hid himself in a doorway nearly opposite. He had hardly done this, before the door of the house opened again, and disclosed the man whom he longed to see. The letter was crumpled in his hand, and his pale face betrayed agitation. He cast wary looks in all directions, and then descended to the sidewalk, and walked fast down Broadway. Bog emerged from his seclusion, and followed him at a distance, always keeping somebody between him and the object of his pursuit. At the corner of Astor Place, young Van Quintem stopped, and Bog came to a halt also, half a block behind. The next minute, the 8th Street stage, going up, approached the corner at a rapid rate, as if the driver were hurrying home to his supper. There were but few persons in the stage. Young Van Quintem hailed the conveyance, jumped in before it could stop, and the driver whipped up his horses to an increased speed. Bog was tired, and he knew not how far he might have to follow the stage at a full trot. He resolved upon his course instantly. Turning the corner of Clinton Place, he ran up that side of the triangular block, and met the stage. He pulled his old cap farther over his eyes, to prevent the possibility of recognition by young Van Quintem, and, gliding swiftly behind the stage, when he was sure that the driver was not looking, hooked on to the step behind, just as he had done 1,000 times when he was a smaller boy. End of Book 11, Chapter 5. Book 11, Chapter 6 of Round the Block by John Bell Bouton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Tract. Young Van Quintem sat at the farther end of the stage, absorbed in his own thoughts. His thin lips moved restlessly at times, as if he were arguing to himself. In his hand he still held the crumpled note. Twice he unfolded it and read the contents carefully, then crushed it in his hand again. Bog watched him through the window of the stage door, not looking straight at him, but with that side vision with which we trace the outline of faint comets. He was aware that young Van Quintem looked at him twice suspiciously, and then settled back into his own meditations. Bog felt safe in his disguise, or rather his original and native dress. When the stage stopped to take in or let out passengers, Bog slipped from his perch and hid himself from the driver's sight. Long experience had taught him how to render himself invisible to that vindictive personage. The stage rolled on to the Greenpoint ferry, dropping all its passengers by the way, excepting the pursued and the pursuer. It was now evident that young Van Quintem was going to Greenpoint. The ferry boat was not in, and would not be in and ready to leave again for 10 minutes. Bog, having seen his game enter the ferry house, thereby conclusively proving his intention to cross the river, slipped into a boiler yard near the ferry. There, against a post, he scrawled, with a stump of pencil, on the back of 2 playbills, which he had brought with him for stationery, 2 notes, as follows: Tuesday evening, about 8 o'clock. Please come to the ferry house on the Greenpoint side, and wait there till I send for you. Bog. These notes he addressed to Mr. Van Quintem, Sr., and Mrs. Crull, at their residences. The next step was to find a boy to deliver them. Bog did not have to wait long for that. Boys of the ragged and city-wise variety may be picked up at any corner of New York at any hour of the day or night. Another 8th Street stage, which came rattling toward the ferry, brought a fine specimen of the juvenile vagrant and daredevil seated on the step. Bog looked out of the boiler yard, and hailed him with a shrill whistle, formed by thrusting 2 fingers in the mouth and blowing fiercely. The boy recognized the signal of his ragged tribe, slid off the seat, and came running to where Bog was standing. As he drew near, Bog recognized him as a trusty lad whom he had employed as file leader in a walking advertisement procession several weeks before. "What yer want, hey?" asked this youth. "Know me?" asked Bog. "Know ye? No. Yer ain't one of our fellers. Look again." Bog raised his ragged cap, and smoothed his hair back. "Why, it's Mr. Bogert. Cuss me if it ain't." "Just so, Bill. I'm trying to catch a chap that owes me something, you see. He's in the ferry house there, waiting for the boat. I'm going to follow him to Greenpoint, and find out where he lives. Then I'll have him arrested. Now, there are 2 people I would like to have as witnesses when I track him to his house. The names are written here. And what I want of you is, to deliver these notes to them as soon as you can, and tell them to come right away. Will you do it, Bill?" "Won't I, Mr. Bogert? Just tell me the names, streets, and numbers, 'cause I can't read handwritin' very well, yer know." Bog read the addresses, and, at the same time, produced a quarter from his fast diminishing stock of silver. "Take that," said he. "No, yer don't," said the eccentric youth. "You've done some good turns to me. Bill Fish don't forget his friends, I can tell yer. Here goes, now." Bill Fish snatched the notes from Bog's hand, and ran down the street after a stage which had just left the ferry house on its dawn trip. Bog saw him seat himself on the step, with his head well hid from the driver, and sent a parting whistle after him, to which Bill Fish responded with an enormous grin, and a jerk of thumb over shoulder at his natural enemy on the box. "I'll give Bill Fish a good job some day," mused Bog. "Now for the scoundrel." The boat had come in. Bog watched from his hiding place until he saw young Van Quintem step on board, and disappear in the ladies' cabin. Then he hastened to the ferry house, paid his fare, and entered. To avoid being seen by young Van Quintem, he took a seat in that repository of stale tobacco smoke called the gentleman's cabin. At the Greenpoint landing, Bog watched young Van Quintem's departure from the boat, and stole out, taking the opposite side of the street. It was then quite dark, and, with reasonable precaution, there was no fear that the pursued would see him. The young profligate walked up the street several blocks, and turned into a side street, occupied by residences, with small shops and groceries at the corners. and occasionally at intervals between them. Suddenly Bog observed him looking around, as if to be sure that he was not watched. Bog slipped behind a large tree. Having apparently come to the conclusion that nobody was observing him, young Van Quintem strode on rapidly a few rods farther, and then made a sharp turn into a neat little millinery shop, which stood quite remote from all other places of business. When the young man's form had disappeared, Bog ran at the top of his speed to a point opposite the shop, where he could readily see what was going on within. The door was open, and a strong light from the interior shone across the street. There was no tree or awning post or other object on the sidewalk behind which he could conceal himself. Exactly opposite to the shop, and in the full blaze of its light, was a high door shutting on a small alleyway. Bog tried the latch, and found the door locked. With instant decision, he caught the top of the door, and vaulted over it, trusting to fortune not to be caught on the inside. Applying his eye to the keyhole, he observed the following condition of things. The shop was a milliner's, beyond all question. It was filled with articles of ladies' wear, whose names and uses were all unknown to Bog, while outside in the air dangled various patterns of skirts which had just then come into fashion, and the public and obtrusive exhibition of which is one of the singularities of our rapid civilization. Behind the counter stood one of those thin ladies who have dedicated themselves to the millinery and a single life. At that distance, she looked to Bog like a perfectly respectable woman, with a sharp eye to business. Farther on, toward the end of the same counter, was the angel of his heart, Patty Minford. Her appearance, pale, and therefore more touchingly beautiful than ever, threw his senses into that sweet flutter which is the proof and mystery of love. He repeated the vow which he had made to himself, and dreamed of fulfilling 1,000 times, to save her from harm at the risk of his life. She was folding up articles on the counter, and packing them into little boxes, and did not look toward young Van Quintem. Bog thought this a good sign. The young man leaned over the counter, and addressed some words to her, to which her lips moved as if in reply, while her eyes were still downcast on her work. He then smoothed out the crumpled note which he had carried in his hand, and placed it before her. She started in amazement as she remarked the close imitation of her handwriting, and, having read it, shook her head with a wondering air. Young Van Quintem's inexpressive face assumed a look of astonishment, and he instantly walked to the door, and peered up and down the street, and opposite. Then he nodded to Miss Minford, as if to excuse himself for a moment, and, darting out of the shop, walked rapidly to the street below, and then to the one above, passing Bog's hiding place on that side of the street, and causing that youth to remove his eye from the keyhole for fear of detection. When he had made this reconnaissance, and satisfied himself that there was no spy about, he returned to the shop. In the meantime, some pantomime had been going on between Miss Minford and the shopwoman, which Bog interpreted to mean that Miss Minford appealed to her for protection, and that the shopwoman promised it. This was followed by the retiring of the young lady through a door in the rear of the shop, and the locking of the door by her female friend, who put the key in her pocket. Young Van Quintem came in, and was surprised not to see Patty. The shopwoman explained with a gesture that she had gone upstairs, whereon he consulted his watch, and then sat down in an armchair in front of the counter, as if with the determination of waiting for her. Bog judged from all the circumstances that Miss Minford would not again show herself for some time, that young Van Quintem would wait, in the hope of seeing her, and that the shopwoman could be depended on as her friend to the last. He therefore concluded that he might safely spend time to go to the ferry house, and procure the company of old Van Quintem and Mrs. Crull, who had probably reached the rendezvous. Watching for an opportunity when the young man's back was turned, Bog lightly vaulted from his hiding place, and noiselessly ran down the street. End of Book 11, Chapter 6. Book 11, Chapter 7 of Round the Block by John Bell BOUTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Found and Lost. When he arrived at the ferry house, the boat was coming in, with his venerable accomplices on board. Upon receiving her cue from the faithful Bill Fish, Mrs. Crull entered her carriage, which had been in readiness for her since Bog started on his search, and was driven to Mr. Van Quintem's. The old gentleman, who was sitting in his study, with his light overcoat and hat on, prepared for any journey, took the spare seat in the carriage, and in less than 25 minutes, by fast driving and the timely cooperation of the ferry boat, they were at the appointed spot. "Have you found her, you dear Bog?" asked Mrs. Crull, breathless. Bog answered, "Yes," and that Mrs. Crull should see her in 5 minutes. That lady then assisted him into the carriage, and kissed him on the forehead in a motherly way, which would have astonished the sedate family coachman, if he had not been entirely used to Mrs. Crull's eccentricities. "My good boy," said old Van Quintem, in a trembling voice, "are you sure we are not too late? Quite sure?" "Sure," said Bog. "Thank God! Thank God!" murmured the old gentleman. Then he looked with a strange interest upon the honest and intelligent face of the lad. He was contrasting the history of the poor boy, which he had learned from Mrs. Crull, with that of his abandoned son. The carriage was stopped, by the order of Bog, who calmly took charge of the whole proceedings, at the corner of the street below the shop, and the party, excepting the driver, walked slowly toward the scene of interest. Old Van Quintem's increasing infirmities compelled him to lean for support on the arm of Mrs. Crull, and also, with greater and more confiding weight, on that of Bog. As the party entered the shop, young Van Quintem was sitting with his head turned toward the door by which Miss Minford had vanished, savagely biting his finger-nails. He wheeled in his chair, and confronted the intruders. "What the are you doing here?" he cried to his father. "We are here to save a young girl from ruin, and you from another crime," said the old gentleman, greatly agitated, and leaning with his whole weight now on Bog's arm. "The you are! And you have brought along an old woman, and a boy that looks like a pickpocket to help you." The phrase "old woman" stirred up Mrs. Crull. She left the old gentleman's side, and advanced to within a yard of the profligate. "Old as I am," said she, "I'm strong enough to spank such a white-livered, broken-down puppy as you are. But I'll leave you to the hands of the law. It's a long lane that hasn't any turning, remember, and you'll pull up at the gallows at last. That's some comfort." Mrs. Crull here became conscious that it was highly impolite to lose her temper, and she fell back to the support of her old friend. Young Van Quintem laughed at her, showing his white teeth unpleasantly. "Ah, I recognize you now," he continued, looking maliciously at the boy Bog. "You are the young thief that tracked me here, are you? I'll settle with you now." He sprang from his chair, and strode toward the lad. He was met halfway by Bog, whom the insulting epithet had stung to the quick. A foe met halfway is half vanquished. A single glance at Bog's clear, courageous eye, and his sinewy proportions, assured young Van Quintem that he had more than his match. "This is no place for a row," he faltered. "I'll attend to you some time in the street." "I shall always be ready for you," said Bog, smiling at this pusillanimous postponement, which is a mild way of making a clear back out. Here the attention of all was called off by the appearance of Miss Minford. The quick ear of the milliner had caught her footstep on the stairs, coming down. She unlocked the door, and the beautiful object of their search stood before them. She was very pale, and tears dimmed her eyes. Mrs. Crull flew toward her, and the poor girl fell on her breast, and cried as if her heart would break. Good Mrs. Crull helped her to a sofa, and sat down, and strained her young friend closely to her bosom. "Be calm," she said, "dear child." Old Van Quintem and Bog looked on with sad interest. The young villain stood in a corner, gnawing his fingernails, and revolving schemes of vengeance. All waited for Miss Minford to become calm before any explanation was sought. Under the soothing caresses of Mrs. Crull, the young girl soon became comparatively tranquil. With her head still pillowed on the broad bosom of her protectress, she made a broken statement to the following effect, in response to the tender questionings of that lady. She said that she had no thought of leaving the house of her dear friend, until he had told her how much better it would be to earn her own living at some easy and pleasant trade, than to be dependent on one who was not a relative. He had also told her that, one day when he was passing the house, he heard Mr. Crull scolding because Mrs. Crull had brought a girl home to be her companion. At this point Mrs. Crull turned furiously toward the pale offender. "You miserable wretch!" said she. "I only wish my dear old man was here, to thrash you soundly. Why, he loved this little darling almost as much as I did. Besides, I'm the mistress of our house, and he never meddles with my affairs. Go on, dear Pet." Pet then stated that he she never called him by his name had promised to get a place for her, and that she, supposing he was a true friend, had accepted the offer of his aid. One day, when they had met by appointment, which was very wrong, she admitted, with a fresh torrent of tears, he told her that he had found a nice situation for her in a milliner's shop in Greenpoint, and that she must come right away, or she would lose the chance. She went home, and packed up her few things in a handkerchief, and came with him here in the carriage. She came directly here, and had not been out of Mrs. Wopping's sight since then. Mrs. Wopping had treated her very, very kindly. Mrs. Wopping, who had been lying in wait for her opportunity, here spoke up. She was a respectable woman, she said, thank God, and had been in the business for 15 years in New York. They could inquire about her in Canal Street, where she had served her apprenticeship; in Division Street, where she had been a forewoman; and in Grand Street, where she had kept a shop. In an evil hour, she had been persuaded to start a millinery establishment in Greenpoint, and a very bad time she had had of it. All she knew about this unfortunate affair was this: the young man there had called on her a few days ago, and said that he wanted to do a favor for an orphan girl, who was a distant relative of his. She was poor, he said, but proud. No strange thing, Mrs. Wopping believed, and would not accept anything directly from him. Therefore, said Mrs. Wopping, he wanted to arrange with me to give her some easy work to do, enough to make her think she was earning her own living, and he would pay me her board, and give me 20 shillings a week to hand to her as her wages. By this plan, I could get a boarder at a fair price, and the services of a young lady to wait on the shop for nothing. Very imprudently, I consented, but not before I had made the young man there swear to heaven that his intentions were honorable. This he did in the most solemn manner. I loved the dear girl at first sight, and determined to watch over her, and keep her from harm. I had a little sister once, long since dead, that much resembled her. I should add, that, though Miss Minford seemed to think very well of the young man there when he brought her here, she became quite suspicious of him yesterday. He was here all yesterday afternoon, and refused to ride out with him, though he had brought a handsome carriage for her. I advised her not to go. "Thank you, good Mrs. Wopping," said Mrs. Crull, shaking that lady by the hand. "You have been a true friend to our dear child, and I'll order my bonnets from you for the future. Virtue shouldn't always be its own reward. You see now, my darling," continued Mrs. Crull, "what a scoundrel you have escaped from. Will you be my adopted child forever? Speak, my precious." Poor Pet threw her soft white arms around the thick neck of her protectress, and cried for joy. "Dear, dear mother!" she murmured. There was a pause, during which everybody but Van Quintem had occasion to wipe their eyes. He paced up and down, his brow wrinkled, and inextinguishable hate flashing from his eyes. "Well, sir," said his father calmly, "what atonement have you to make for this outrage? You're a old fool, and that's all I've got to say." "Heaven be praised that his poor mother was not spared for this sorrow," was the tranquil reply. "Curse you, and the old woman's memory! You're always making a fuss about her." The benignant expression of old Van Quintem's face vanished instantly, and a just rage gleamed on every feature. "Unnatural son! Monster! Fiend!" he cried, raising his hands aloft. "At last you have gone too far. Leave my presence, sir, and never, never let me see your face again. I say to you, and before these witnesses, that I disown and disinherit you for ever, for ever, for ever." The coward son could not endure that terrible visitation of parental wrath, and fled without another word from the shop. Old Van Quintem fell exhausted upon the strong shoulder of the boy Bog. "Henceforth," said he, you shall be my son." Book 11, Chapter 7. Book 12, Chapter 1 of Round the Block by John Bell Bouton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 12. Speculations, Pecuniary and Matrimonial. Chapter 1. The Cosmopolitan Window Fastener. The Cosmopolitan Window Fastener was a veritable success. For the first time in his life, Mr. Wesley Tiffles's theories had been demonstrated by results. Had the Cosmopolitan Window Fastener been his own invention, and disposed of for his own behoof, he would have abandoned it long before its merits had been fairly tested, and tried some other of the myriad schemes that floated through his brain. But the profits of the Cosmopolitan Window Fastener went to another, and this was the secret of Wesley Tiffles's persistent, and therefore successful, exertions. This was his plan of operations. In the first place, from the funds supplied by Marcus Wilkeson, he procured a patent for the invention. In the second place, he put an advertisement a column long in every daily paper, 6 insertions paid in advance, and handed a highly polished brass model of the invention to the editor, with a request to notice if perfectly agreeable. The just and logical result followed. Instead of the 10-line paragraph with which patent churns and washing machines are ordinarily turned loose on society, the Cosmopolitan window fastener received notices so long and ornate that it was quite impossible to derive from them a correct idea of the matchless simplicity of the invention. Having thus roused public curiosity, Tiffles, in the third place, took an office on Broadway, and put up a large sign inscribed in gilt capitals, "The Cosmopolitan Window Fastener Manufacturing Company." From this pou sto, Archimedes-like, he commenced to move the world of house owners. This he accomplished by the following manoeuvre. He caused double-leaded advertisements under the head of "Special Notices" to be inserted in all the papers, informing the public that it would be utterly impossible to supply the demand for the Cosmopolitan window fastener, and that therefore it would be useless to send in orders. The company were employing all the resources of 2 large manufacturing establishments, but it was evident that these would fail to meet the extraordinary and totally unexpected demand for this indispensable protection against burglars, this moral safeguard, as it might not inappropriately be called, of civilized homes. The company had made every effort, but without success, to secure a force of skilled workmen equal to the emergency. Justice to their customers in all parts of the country compelled the company to announce that no orders received after that date could be filled under 2 months. Under these remarkable, they might say, in some respects disagreeable, circumstances, they begged leave to throw themselves on the indulgence of a generous public. These notices were put forth not only in the form of newspaper advertisements, but as placards and handbills, which were stuck all over the city and thrown into all the stages, falling like autumn leaves into the laps of passengers. This was the cooperative work of the boy Bog, who, though adopted by old Van Quintem as his son and heir, had not yet given up the bill-sticking business, but, on the contrary, had increased it, and now had a practical monopoly of it in the city, with branches in the suburbs. Bog would not eat the bread of idleness, and so he had modestly told Mr. Van Quintem, and that fine old gentleman had patted him on the back, and told him that there was genuine Dutch blood in him. Bogert and Company now employed 100 lads, and Bog's department of labor was the general planning of operations, and the receiving and disbursement of the money, and a very nice and agreeable department it was. It enabled Bog to dress neatly, and keep his hands clean, 2 points upon which he was now extremely fastidious. Bog was growing tall, manly, and handsome. He was also showing a great improvement in his grammar and pronunciation, the fruit of diligent attendance at the evening school. The public being thus continually informed that orders for the Cosmopolitan window fastener could not possibly be filled under 2 months, very naturally began to send in orders for the invaluable invention, to be filled after that period. Every mail brought hundreds of them from all parts of the country. The company, that is, Wesley Tiffles, sat at their desk in the Broadway office from 9 to 3 o'clock, exhibiting the window fastener to hundreds of visitors, and receiving orders rather as a matter of favor to the customer than to the company. At the end of a month, when orders to the amount of nearly $75,000 had been received, every northern and western state being extensively represented on the books. The company issued another advertisement, to the effect that, owing to the overwhelming pressure of business, they were willing to dispose of patent rights for 2 of the states. There was a rush of applicants, to all of whom the company could truthfully exhibit large and genuine orders from all the states. The rights for 2 states were readily sold, and the company then found that they could spare 1 more, for a fair compensation, and so on, until every state in the Union had been disposed of, and the company had not an inch of United States territory left. Not only this, but liberal purchasers were found for Cuba, Canada, South America, England, France, Germany, Russia, and all the countries of the continent. In 3 months, the company had disposed of their entire interest, and realized about $100,000 cash. This sum Tiffles had faithfully paid over, as fast as received, to Fayette Overtop, who not only represented Marcus Wilkeson, unknown to Pet, but was Pet's own attorney and agent. By Fayette Overtop it was placed in bank, credited to Miss Patty Minford, and subject to her order alone. Thus it happened that the poor inventor had not toiled in vain for the child that he loved. Tiffles, with that strange unselfishness sometimes found in men of his class, had not thought of or desired any compensation for his services, other than the payment of all the bills incurred in the operation. The pleasure which he took in manipulating the public, and seeing his labors crowned with success, was the only reward that he wished for. Marcus Wilkeson, however, as soon as he saw that Tiffles was actually about to perform the amazing feat of raising money, determined, as an act of common justice, to insist upon his receiving 20% of the total. Tiffles flatly refused at first, saying, which was true, that he could work a great deal better if he had no personal interest in the scheme, but yielded, at length, to the earnest solicitations of Marcus, backed by the emphatic declaration of Miss Minford, through her attorney, that she would not touch a penny of the money unless he consented. So when the affairs of the company were wound up, Tiffles found himself the possessor of $20,000, a sum whose existence in a concrete form he had always secretly disbelieved. And Tiffles' first act was to settle up all his outstanding debts. The unexpected acquisition of this immense sum imparted a charm to every object in life, except Miss Philomela Wilkeson. Poor Miss Wilkeson was quick to discern the change in Tiffles' manner toward her. His calls were as frequent as ever, but were exclusively on her half-brother, and had no side bearing in her direction. He no longer lingered in the entry to converse with her, and flatly refused her invitation to take a glass of wine in the dining-room. Most ominous of signs, he did not press her hand in the least when he took it in his own. His voice was no longer winning, but harsh and neglectful. Indifference brooded in the heart of the monster. The worst of it was that he had been so cautious and non-committal in his declarations, that she could not upbraid him for his perfidy. With a cold calculation worthy of a demon, he had made love in the pantomimic way, and eschewed written or verbal communications of an erotic nature. No jury could have mulcted him 1 cent for damages in a breach of promise case, and he knew it. While Wesley Tiffles slipped off Miss Wilkeson like a loose glove, she might as well have tried to divest herself of her natural cuticle as to banish all thoughts of him. Miss Wilkeson was accustomed to allude mysteriously to certain sentimental affairs of her youth. In confidential moments, her friends had been favored with shadowy reminiscences of a romantic past. But truth compels us to state that Miss Wilkeson had never been the recipient of that delicate and awkward thing known as a proposal, and that she had never been kissed by man or boy since she wore long dresses. Hence the magnified importance which she attached to that kiss which, in a moment of reckless but cheap gallantry, Wesley Tiffles, on one fatal evening, had impressed upon her withered hand. She loved the destroyer of her peace with the pent-up energies of 40 years. End of Book 12, Chapter 1. Book 12, Chapter 2 of Round the Block by John Bell Bouton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Middle-aged Cupid. Being in ignorance of Tiffles's sudden fortune, she was at a loss how to explain his defection. She conjectured all things, and finally settled down to the conclusion that he was a coy young man, and had not been sufficiently encouraged by her. She remembered instances where he had exhibited signs of ardor, in one case so far as beginning to slip a hand around her waist, and she had repelled him. He was evidently waiting for some marked encouragement. How foolishly prudish she had been! One evening, as Wesley Tiffles was passing through the hall to the door, after a rattling hour with the 3 bachelors, he was confronted by Miss Wilkeson, who chanced to leave the front parlor on a journey upstairs at that moment. She was dressed in a light silk, and her hair was carefully braided, and her face had a pink color in some parts, which contrasted well with the pallor in other parts, and her glass had told her that she was looking uncommonly youthful and charming. She had carefully studied her part, which was to be a bold one, throwing off all reserve. "Good evening, Mr. Tiffles," said she, promptly offering her hand. He took it with unsqueezing indifference. She had expected that. "Mr. Tiffles," said she, with an air of youthful raillery, "you are a naughty man, and I had an idea of not speaking to you again." "Naughty!" said Tiffles, astonished. "How?" "Why, you have hardly been civil to me of late. I do believe you wouldn't speak or shake hands with me if I didn't always set the example." This in a half-complaining, half-laughing way. It suddenly flashed upon Tiffles that he had been, for some time, rather neglectful of the lady. It also forcibly occurred to him that it was wise policy to be on good terms, at all times, with the mistress of the house, and such was Miss Wilkeson's present position. He therefore clutched her hand again, gave it a faint squeeze, and said that he apologized a million times for his rudeness, but the fact was, he had so much business on hand, that he had been turned into a perfect bear, he supposed. He playfully challenged Miss Wilkeson to step into the parlor and take a glass of wine, and he would show her that he was not the brute she fancied. Miss Wilkeson laughingly accepted the challenge. "But I do believe," she added, "that it is only the glass of wine you care for. Now tell me, Mr. Tiffles, aren't you a woman-hater?" When a man is asked that question categorically by a woman, his most effective answer is to make love to her out of hand. Tiffles was not prepared to do this in the present case, but he was willing to pay compliments to any extent. "Ah, Miss Wilkeson, there you do me great injustice," said he, with his pleasantest of laughs. "I drink this glass of wine to lovely woman," with a nod at Miss Wilkeson. Miss Wilkeson giggled, and took a fly's sip from the brim of her glass. Tiffles heaved a sigh. "We bachelors are poor, unhappy fellows, really to be pitied. You are horrid creatures, you know you are, and deserve no pity from us." Miss Wilkeson played her frisky juvenile part admirably. "So charming, and yet so cruel," said Tiffles, uttering the first preposterous compliment that he thought of. "You flatterer!" said Miss Wilkeson, beating a breeze toward him with her fan. Tiffles, observing that matters were coming to a crisis, paused. Miss Wilkeson interpreted his silence as another attack of timidity. Time was valuable to her, and this kind of conversation might be kept up all night, and amount to nothing. She resolved upon her final coup. "Oh! Oh! Mr. Tiffles, what is the matter?" She looked wildly about her. "The matter? What matter?" exclaimed that gentleman, little suspecting what was to happen. "The wine, the warm weather, something. Oh! Oh!" With these inexplicable remarks, Miss Wilkeson dropped her fan, uttered a slight but sharp scream, and fell back in her chair, like a withered flower on a broken stalk. "By thunder, she has fainted!" said the excited Tiffles. He had never been in a similar dilemma, and did not know what to do. He had heard tickling of the feet highly recommended in such cases, but that was obviously impracticable. A dash of cold water in the face was also said to afford instant relief, but there was no water at hand. "I must call for help," said he. This remark appeared to arouse Miss Wilkeson. "Support me," she murmured. "I shall be better soon." Tiffles, all accommodation, clasped her fragile waist with an arm, and gently inclined her head upon his shoulder. She heaved a sigh, and gave other tokens of returning animation. Tiffles here noticed that her face had not the prevailing paleness which always accompanies fainting. He instantly suspected the true nature of Miss Wilkeson's complaint. The noise of quick footsteps resounded in the entry. Marcus, Overtop, and Maltboy had heard the sharp scream, and were rushing to the rescue. "Good heavens! What will they say?" exclaimed Tiffles. "Don't be silly, Miss Wilkeson, at your time of life." This cutting remark was wrung from him by the annoyance and confusion of the moment. It served as a wonderful anodyne, for Miss Wilkeson jerked herself into an erect position, and said, "You're a fool." At this juncture, before Tiffles had quite uncoiled his serpentine arms from her, and while she was looking fiery indignation at him, the door was pushed open, and the three bachelors rushed in. "I really beg pardon," said Marcus. "No occasion for my services, I see. Ahem! Heard a scream. Thought it was here. No intention to intrude," added Overtop. The tableau reminded Maltboy of his own innumerable little affairs, and he laughed. "It's a lover's quarrel," said he, "and not to be interrupted, of course." The three bachelors hastily evacuated the room, and their merry laughs rang in the entry. "Miss Wilkeson," said Tiffles, consulting his watch. He carried a gold one, with an enormous gold chain. "You must really excuse me. Important business engagement at 9. Good evening." So saying, Tiffles precipitately retired, with the determination not to enter the house again until he knew that Miss Wilkeson was out of it. A week from that memorable day, Tiffles met Marcus Wilkeson on Broadway. "Why haven't you been to see us?" said Marcus. "Not been very smart of late," explained Tiffles. "Fainting fits, perhaps. Maybe they are catching, eh?" Tiffles smiled, for he saw that Marcus knew the truth. "How is Miss Wilkeson?" he asked respectfully. "She has gone into the country for her health, and will probably stay away a number of years. In short, I have engaged for her the position of first preceptress of a female seminary in the middle of the state. She said she was quite sick of the hollow and heartless life of New York." Marcus spoke truly. Miss Wilkeson had retired to the country with a thorough feeling of disgust for town existence. She has taught for several years, and is still teaching in the Young Ladies' Seminary, with eminent success, though her fair pupils complain, with much pretty pouting, of her savage restrictions upon all walks and talks with the eligible young beaux of the village. They say that she hates the men, and they call her a cross old maid, and a great number of other hard epithets. But sometimes a tear is observed in the corner of her eye, which she hastily wipes away. That tear is an oblation upon the memory of a lost love. That lost love was, and is, and always will be, Wesley Tiffles. End of Book 12, Chapter 2. Book 12, Chapter 3 of Round the Block by John Bell Bouton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Slapman vs. Slapman. The case of Slapman vs. Slapman occupied the attention of the referee, Samuel Goldfinch, Esquire, over 2 months. That gentleman was corpulent, fond of good dinners, and had a highly cultivated taste for scandal. It had been his custom to give this interesting case a hearing 1 or 2 hours every afternoon, daily, after court. It was a relief from the heavy business of the day, for Goldfinch had heavy business, which came to him because he was a fat and pleasant fellow, with a large head, and a great circle of miscellaneous acquaintance. The real work of the office was done by a modest, unappreciated man named Mixer. On the occasion of these anti-matrimonial audiences, Mixer sat in the back room, grubbing among his dusty papers, while Samuel Goldfinch, Esquire, in the front room, with doors shut, leaned back in his easy-chair, and surrendered himself to enjoyment. In the case of Slapman vs. Slapman, a great number of witnesses had been examined on each side. Affidavits, amounting to hundreds of pages, had been obtained in distant states, some as far away as California. The lawyers had spared neither their own time nor the money of their clients in raking together testimony which would bear, in the slightest degree, upon the interests which they represented. All the relatives of Mr. Slapman had testified that he was a gentleman uniformly kind and courteous, possessing a singular placidity of temper, and indulgent to his wife to a degree where indulgence became a fault. Those relatives, and they were numerous, particularly in the country branch, who had passed anniversary weekends at Mr. Slapman's house, were very severe on Mrs. Slapman. She was a proud, disagreeable woman. She was continually snubbing her husband before people. She had a great many male friends, whose acquaintance she had retained in defiance of his wishes. She was known to have received letters from men, and when her husband had desired to peruse them, had laughed at him. It is true that she pretended to be a patroness of literature, science, and the arts, but anybody could see that those were only the cover of the grossest improprieties. She had been heard to listen without remonstrance to declarations of love from several young men. It turned out upon cross-examination that these irregularities took place in charades and plays, of which Mr. Slapman's relatives had been shocked spectators. With regard to Mr. Overtop's transactions in the family, they could say nothing, for they had long since ceased to visit Mrs. Slapman on account of her disgraceful conduct. And also, they might have added, but they did not add, because Mrs. Slapman latterly had her house full of Jigbees, and put her husband's relatives into obscure rooms in the 3rd story, and quite forgot their existence afterward. Per contra, all the Jigbees, and they were a prolific race, swore that their distinguished relative was a pattern of artlessness and innocence, that she was remarkable from early childhood for a charming frankness and transparent candor, that when this bright ornament of the Jigbee stock was sought in marriage by the defendant, the whole family, with one mind and voice, opposed the match. They had felt that a being of her exalted intellectual tastes was too good for a sordid, money-getting creature like Slapman. But that man, by his ingenious artifices, had succeeded in winning the hand of their gifted kinswoman, and married her against their unanimous protests. There was but one consolation for this family misfortune. Mr. Slapman was reported to be wealthy, and could afford to indulge his wife in the exercise of her noble longings for truth. They were willing to say that Mr. Slapman had not been illiberal, so far as vulgar money was concerned. He had given to his wife the house and lot which she occupied, and had never stinted her in respect of allowances. But what was money to a woman of Mrs. Slapman's soul, when her husband withheld from her his confidence and trust, regarded her innocent labors in behalf of art, literature, and the drama, with a cold, unsympathizing eye, and finally descended so low as to feel a brutal jealousy of those gentlemen of talent, of whom she was the revered patroness? Money, we are quoting here from the remarks of Mrs. Slapman's eminent counsel, is very desirable in its way, but is it not the vilest dross, your honor, when compared with the pure gold of connubial trust and sympathy? Mr. Goldfinch nodded his head, as if to say that he rather thought it was. The testimony of two servant girls established the fact that Mr. Slapman had several times been overheard to tell his wife that she would regret it, and that the time was fast coming when forbearance would cease to be a virtue; also that the worm, when trodden on repeatedly, might at last turn and sting, and many other enigmatical sayings of that character. The very vagueness of these threats, implying unknown horrors, had inspired his wife with a mortal dread of him. She did not know at what moment this jealous and revengeful man might strike her dead. She had been living in the fear of her life for 6 years, and during all this time had never complained or expressed that fear to one of her relatives or friends. Such is the noble, uncomplaining nature, said the eminent counsel, in reference to this fact, of the woman that fate has thrown into the arms of a fiend. But the most striking proof of Mr. Slapman's murderous designs upon his wife was his conduct at the last dramatic soirée. 20 witnesses swore that it was his evident intention to spring on her and strangle her, and that he was only thwarted in this horrid purpose by the noble courage of Fayette Overtop, Esquire. Mr. Overtop briefly and modestly testified to this effect also, and furthermore narrated all the particulars of his acquaintance with Mrs. Slapman, holding before her a shield, from which the arrows of calumny, aimed by her husband, fell harmless. Mr. Slapman had not shown himself in the referee's office since the investigation began. He had become convinced that he had lost the case into which his mad jealousy and his lawyer's advice had plunged him. Mrs. Slapman, according to the testimony of the 2 servants and several others, was immured in her house, and brooding over this saddest episode in her unhappy history. "Nothing but that instinct of self-preservation," said the eminent counsel, "which bids the dove to fly from the hawk, and the rabbit to evade the pursuing hounds, could have induced that delicate, shrinking lady to lay bare the horrors of her prison house to the world, and to ask, in the name of common humanity, a release from the tyrant, and a liberal alimony." The eminent counsel repeated this flight of fancy in the ear of Mrs. Slapman, at the opera that evening, whither she was accompanied by a few of the Jigbees, and she smiled, and said that it was really beautiful. The protracted case, of which we have given a mere sketch, was decided by Samuel Goldfinch, Esq., in favor of the lady. A separation was decreed, and alimony fixed at $6,000 a year, that being only a wife's fair proportion of Mr. Slapman's income. Mrs. Slapman, with a well assumed appearance of levity, gave a grande soirée musicale et dramatique at her house in honor of the event, at which Overtop was a favored guest. Mr. Slapman went direct to Slapmanville, and raised the rent on all his tenants, turned a superannuated non-paying couple into the street, and took a general account of his property, to see how much he could sell out for, preparatory to leaving for Europe, and so dodging the payment of the alimony. The illustrated papers published two portraits, one of an angel, the other of a demon. The angel was Mrs. Slapman. The demon was her husband. The comic papers served him up in puns, conundrums, and acrostics of the most satirical import. The daily papers, always on the lookout for subjects to write about, improved the occasion to overhaul the question of divorce, in its statistical, moral, social, and religious bearings. Two editors, in pursuance of a previous agreement, continued to discuss the question with great warmth in their respective journals, until they had written about 200 octavo pages, when the debate was published in book form, with paper covers, and sold for their joint benefit. End of Book 12, Chapter 3. Book 12, Chapter 4 of Round the Block by John Bell Bouton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How Overtop sealed a contract in a way unknown to Chitty. The notoriety which Fayette Overtop had derived from his questionable connection with the Slapman divorce case had, as has been already stated, materially contributed to his professional income. By the time the case was decided, the firm of Overtop and Maltboy ranked among the most successful of the junior bar. Now that Overtop had his hands full of business, his thoughts reverted to matrimony more strongly than ever. It is a singular fact, that business men find more time to think of marriage than men of leisure. Thoughts of matrimony invariably brought Miss Pillbody into Overtop's head. He would project mental photographs of her at the top of a table, beaming sweetly upon him opposite, with her dim, lovely eyes, and pouring out the tea from a small silver pot. Overtop never could explain it, but this imaginary picture realized all his desires of domestic happiness. Overtop not only thought of Miss Pillbody, but, what was more to the purpose, he visited her. For this, pretexts were not wanting. They never are. At first he professed to have been requested by a friend in the country to find a suitable private school for two young daughters. This justified several visits, until Miss Pillbody could decide positively that it would be impossible for her to take them, an announcement which greatly relieved Overtop, though it temporarily put an end to his calls. Then he hit upon the expedient of pretending to write an essay on popular education for a monthly magazine, and desired to obtain hints from her upon the subject. Miss Pillbody, not displeased with the compliment, though declaring that she had not an idea to give him, gave him a great many good ideas, to which he appeared to listen, while he was contemplating her trim figure, and the animated expression of her face, and thinking how very well she would look at the head of that poetical table behind that phantom teapot. At last the topic of popular education ran out, and Overtop felt that this kind of imposition could not be practiced much longer. One day, while Overtop sat at his desk, with a mass of law papers before him, thinking not of them, but of his dilemma with respect of Miss Pillbody, A small boy brought him a beautifully written little note from that lady, asking him to call that evening on business. Overtop sent a reply, written with extraordinary care (this is a sign of love), saying that he would be happy to call, as requested. At the same time, he felt a pang of apprehension that she had found places in her school for the two young daughters of his supposititious country friend. Overtop dressed with unusual care that evening, and presented himself at Miss Pillbody's house, punctually at the appointed hour. The young teacher was hard at work in the back parlor, setting copy for the illiterate wife of a rich city contractor to try her brawny fist on next day. Miss Pillbody's bewitching eyeglasses bestrided her nose, and the narrow collar, wristbands, and dainty apron with the red-bound pockets, looked whiter than ever. The teacher blushed slightly as Overtop entered, and put away the copybook on a high shelf, thereby intimating that she should not work more that night, and Overtop could stay as long as he would. Thus, at least, that sagacious student of men, women, and things interpreted it. Without a particle of those preliminary commonplaces for which Overtop had a cherished aversion, Miss Pillbody broke into business at once. She said that a Mrs. Cudgeon, the wife of a citizen who had made a large fortune in butter and eggs, had been taking lessons in all the English branches, and French (here Miss Pillbody smiled) for 6 months, but had postponed payment on one pretext and another, and had finally withdrawn from the school, leaving unpaid tuition to the amount of $150. Miss Pillbody had written several dunning letters to Mrs. Cudgeon, and received no answer. The soft grass of epistolary entreaty having failed, Miss P. now proposed to try what virtue there was in the hard stones of the law. She had sent to Mr. Overtop for advice. Overtop listened to the statement of the case with professional attentiveness. He was sub-thinking all the time what an extremely sensible woman Miss Pillbody was, not to allow herself to be cheated, but to go to law in defense of her rights. He assured his interesting client that she could count on his best services, and that she might consider the $150 as good as recovered. From this point the conversation glided off into a wilderness of general topics. Overtop had a habit, a bad one it must be confessed, of sounding people's mental depths. He found that Miss Pillbody was no shallow thinker. He left the house at 11 o'clock, supposing it was 10, and had a delightful vision that night of the little round table and the teapot, and the presiding angel. Next day Overtop wrote the following letter: New York, . Mr. J. Cudgeon, Sir, enclosed is a bill of items amounting to $150 for your wife's tuition at Miss Pillbody's private school. Be good enough to look it over, and inform me, to-morrow, what you will do about it. I will tell you candidly, that it is for our interest, as a young law firm, to sue you for the debt, but my client will not consent to this until all other efforts fail, out of regard to the feelings of Mrs. C. Your obedient servant, Overtop and Maltboy, No. Building, J. Cudgeon, Esq. Overtop remembered that one J. Cudgeon had run for the Assembly at the previous fall election, and he surmised that, being a politician and a public character, J. Cudgeon would not like to see the bill of items in print. Overtop reasoned correctly, for at 10 a.m. the following day, that gentleman called at the office and paid the $150, and said that he was very much obliged to Overtop and Maltboy for their gentlemanly conduct in the affair. Mr. Cudgeon had not been aware of his wife's pupilage at Miss Pillbody's private school, though he had observed, he added confidentially, for some months past, a slight improvement in her grammar. "I am not ashamed to say that we were poor once," said Mr. Cudgeon, with a glow of pride, when Overtop placed the $150 in the white hand of the schoolmistress. She looked at him with gratitude and admiration, which more than repaid him. Not only this, but she asked him, with not a particle of hesitation, how much his fee was. "Fee!" exclaimed Overtop, a little nettled at the implied insult. Young lawyers are apt to be. "Nothing, Miss Pillbody. Decidedly nothing." "But I prefer to pay you, Mr. Overtop. Why should you work for me for nothing, when I am not willing to do the same thing for Mrs. Cudgeon? The laborer is worthy of his hire," she added, laughing. "I set that adage in a copybook to night." "But I won't take anything," said Overtop, no longer nettled, but charmed to perceive this exhibition of sound good sense in a young lady. "But I insist that you shall," continued Miss Pillbody, pleasantly. "Tell me, now, how much is it?" Overtop was standing within 2 feet of the schoolmistress, and her soft, dim eyes were beaming right into his. We leave psychologists to settle the phenomenon as they will, but the fact was, that each saw love in the eyes of the other. Overtop, in his bachelor musings, had thought over 100 odd methods of putting the question. At this critical moment in the history of 2 hearts, a new form of the proposition occurred to him, so original and eccentric that he determined to propound it at once. He took Miss Pillbody's hand in his before she knew it. She blushed and would have withdrawn it, but he retained the hand with a gentle pressure. "My dear Miss Pillbody," said Overtop, "I will take $5 from you on one condition, and no other. Will you grant it?" The schoolmistress, not knowing what she was saying, said, "Yes. The condition is, that I shall buy an engagement ring, and put it on this dear hand." Miss Pillbody blushed, and cast down her gentle eyes. The sagacious young lawyer, interpreting these signs as a full consent, stole his arm around her waist, and sealed the contract in a way all unknown to Chitty. End of Book 12, Chapter 4. Book 12, Chapter 5 of Round the Block by John Bell BOUTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A returned Californian. At last, Matthew Maltboy was engaged. He had, since 20, been dallying on the edge of a betrothal. Now he had taken the momentous step into that anomalous region which lies between celibacy and married life, where a man is not exactly a bachelor, nor yet, by any means, a husband. It is the land in which the dim enchantments of romance begin to assume the plain outlines of reality. It is the land in which the pledge of undying affection, breathed, at some rapturous moment, into a delicate, inclining ear, becomes invested with awful meaning, and has a value in the legal market like a bond and mortgage. It is the land where the excitement of pursuit is over, and the game is securely cornered, but not yet in hand. It is the spot where the ardent huntsman of love pauses to look back, and ceases to bend his longing gaze into the distance beyond. How it came to pass that the unreliable Matthew Maltboy had become the affianced one of the pleasant widow Frump, it is not the purpose of this history to record. Let it suffice to say, that the mutual aversion which they felt some months before at Mr. Whedell's house on New Year's Day was the starting point of their course of true love. Such an aversion, subsequently smoothed away, is often the most promising beginning of a courtship. Mrs. Frump had frequently met Matthew on the street, and been gratified with his deferential bow. His bulk, to which, as a rotund lady, she had taken an antipathy, seemed to dwindle down as it was looked at. Matthew, whose ideal was a delicate woman with observable shoulder blades, had also, by repeated sights of Mrs. Frump, become reconciled to her ample proportions. Meanwhile, they had heard much, incidentally, of each other through Marcus Wilkeson. Matthew had come to esteem Mrs. Frump for her affectionate devotion to old Van Quintem, and Mrs. Frump had secretly admired the powerful though silent legal ability displayed by Mr. Maltboy in the inquisition before Coroner Bullfast. One night, Matthew accompanied Marcus to his old friend's house, and on the second night following, this couple were engaged, a happy event, which was brought about no less by the widow's experience and conviction that there was no time to lose, than by Matthew's impulsive ardor. He had been engaged 10 days, and so entirely had he talked out the time to the widow that it seemed 6 months. Why is it, thought Matthew, stretching himself in his chair, and looking critically at the widow, who was knitting crochet work, why is it that I no longer adore her? She is just as pretty, just as amiable, just as affectionate as ever. Now, why don't I care a button for her at this moment? Matthew was not a transcendental philosopher, and the true answers to these questions did not come to him. Old Van Quintem, pale and beautiful in his declining years, sat by the window that opened on the green leaves of the back yard, calmly smoking his pipe, and thinking, with a holy sadness, of his dead wife and his worse-than-dead son. The old gentleman, and the 2 quiet affianced ones, who sat near him, made up a well-dressed and handsome group, the pictorial effect of which was suddenly marred by the apparition of a stranger in the doorway. He was tall, muscular, and what little could be seen of his face through a heavy growth of whiskers was mild and prepossessing, in spite of 2 large scars just visible below the broad brim of a rough hat. His dress was faded and dirty. The stranger stood in the doorway, and surveyed the occupants of the room. Old Van Quintem looked at the intruder a moment, and then said, as if remembering something, "Are you the man sent by Crumley to mend my piazza railing?" There was the least hesitation in the man's voice, as he answered, "Yes, sir. I'm here to do that job." His voice was a deep growl, as of a grizzly bear half tamed. "Where are your tools?" asked old Van Quintem. The stranger communed with himself, and then replied in the most natural manner, "I s'pose I only want a saw, a hammer, and a few nails. You have 'em, haven't yer?" "You're a funny sort of carpenter, to travel without your tools. Do you know now that you look more like a California miner than a carpenter?" "That's not very 'markable," returned the stranger, in profound guttural accents, "considerin' as how I come from California this week." "You have brought home tons of gold, I dare say," said old Van Quintem, playfully. "A little," growled the stranger. "The diggin's was poor in Calaveras County when I fust went there, but latterly they improved." At the mention of Calaveras County, the widow suddenly fixed her eyes upon the stranger, and then dropped them on her crochet work. Matthew Maltboy here conceived a happy thought, namely, to ask this stranger if he ever knew Amos Frump, the deceased husband of Mrs. Frump, who was killed in that very county in an affray growing out of a disputed claim 5 years before. Mrs. Frump, after her engagement to Matthew, had furnished him with slips from 3 California papers, giving full particulars of the sanguinary affair. Before he was engaged, he had never felt the slightest curiosity to know the history of his predecessor; but since then he had entertained a strong secret desire to learn more of him, and especially of the reasons which induced him to abandon a young and lovely wife, and make a Californian exile of himself. Upon this subject the widow had never volunteered any satisfactory information, and he had been politely reluctant to ask her about it. Old Van Quintem, who was too sleepy at that time to talk much, procured the necessary tools from a cupboard in the kitchen, and showed the stranger what work was to be done. The old gentleman then returned to his easy chair by the window, threw a handkerchief over his head, and settled himself for a nap. Before the carpenter had struck the first blow, Matthew Maltboy rose, remarked to the widow that he wanted to stretch himself a little, and walked out upon the piazza. The carpenter stood near the door, with the saw in one hand and the hammer in the other, very much in the attitude of listening. At Matthew's approach, he commenced feeling the teeth of the saw, as if to test their sharpness. "I would like to speak a word with you, sir," said Matthew, in a low voice, motioning the carpenter to accompany him to a corner of the piazza, out of the widow's possible hearing. Having attained that safe position, Matthew opened the great subject. "You remarked that you had dug gold in Calaveras County," said he. "Did you ever happen to know a man by the name of Frump, Amos Frump, who was a miner there?" "Frump?" replied the carpenter. "He was an intimate friend of mine." "Now that's lucky," said Matthew, "for I want to find out something about the man." "Then you've come to the right shop," answered the carpenter; "for his own brother, if he ever had one, couldn't tell you more about him than I." "I am indeed fortunate. In the first place, then, this man Frump is really dead?" The carpenter pulled his rough hat farther over his forehead, and replied, "As dead as two big splits in the skull could make him. But excuse me, sir. He was my bosom friend, and I can't bear to talk of his death." "He is dead, then, and no mistake," said Matthew, soliloquizing. "Yet I am not exactly glad to know it." The carpenter's face expressed surprise at this remark. "I beg your pardon," said Matthew. "Of course I am not glad to hear of your friend's death. But, to tell the truth," he continued, inventing an excuse, "I had always heard that this Frump was a wild fellow, that he didn't treat his wife decently, and at last ran away from her. You see, I am acquainted with the family. In fact, I know Mrs. Frump quite well." "And did she tell you all this about her dead husband?" asked the carpenter. "Oh, no!" returned Matthew, who began to fear that he had gone too far. "She never says anything about his personal character. I only spoke from common report." "Then common report is a common liar; for I know there never was a steadier chap than this same Amos Frump, and his wife can't say that he ever struck her, or said a cross word to her. Amos told me all about himself, and I'd believe him through thick and thin." The carpenter spoke in his dismal chest voice, without the least indication of excitement. "Then why did he leave his wife? And why did she never hear of him until the time of his death? You will confess that that was odd." "I give you the reasons," answered the carpenter, "as Amos give 'em to me. It seems that he was a poor, uneducated feller. She had a few $1,000 from her grandfather's property, and was sent by her parents to the best of schools. Though he and she were so much unlike, they got up a kind of fondness for each other from the time when Amos saved her from bein' run over by a horse. They used to meet each other secretly, because, you see, her folks didn't like Amos. They thought that a girl with $3,000 or $4,000 in her own name ought to set her eyes rather above a feller like him. Well, arter no end o' trouble, they was married. Her folks pretended to treat Amos all right, but was allers talkin' agin him. And finally they pisoned her mind with the idee that he had married her only for her money, and that all the while he loved another gal. She began to treat him very cold like, and, one day, when she was in a little bit of temper—" "Has Mrs. Frump any temper?" asked Matthew, anxiously. "I never saw it." "But you ain't her husband," replied the carpenter. "Amos told me that she did show a leetle temper now and then. However, he allers said she was a pooty good gal in the main. Well, one day, when her dander was up about somethin', She told him that she believed he married her for her money, and she'd die before he should have a cent. Amos was a proud feller, if he was poor, and when he heerd this, he left the house right off, walked to New York, and shipped as a sailor to San Francisco. I met him when he fust come to the mines, and as he was a spry, tough chap, I let him work a claim with me on shares. We ate and slept together, and many a time, in the dark night, has he spoke to me about his wife, and how much he thought of her. But he said he never should go back till he had money enough to buy out her and her hull family. We was very unlucky, and Amos got downhearted and took to drink. By and by he moved off to another claim, and worked on his own hook. He did better there, but all the gold he dug out he used to spend in gamblin' and rum, and at last a drunken quarrel put an end to Amos Frump." "Poor fellow!" said Matthew. "And do you think the widow ever grieved for him?" "No, I guess not; for Amos allers said that she was not a very lovin', affectionate woman, though if he had been as rich as her, or if her family had let her alone, she would have made him a tolerable wife." "Not loving? Not affectionate?" thought Matthew. "And I am about to marry her." A cold shudder crept over him. Hiding his emotions with an effort, he again interrogated the affable carpenter. "And do you really think that Mr. Frump would have returned and lived again with his wife if he had become rich?" "To be sure he would. He couldn't marry anybody else, yer know, without committin' bigamy. He allers said he didn't care much whether his wife loved him, so long as she treated him civilly." "Mr. Frump had practical views of married life," suggested Matthew. "Amos was sensible in some things," said the carpenter, "but he was a queer feller, too. He allers had a notion of comin' home kind o' disguised, so that his wife shouldn't know him. I used to tell him that a few more years in Californy would make him so thin, yaller, and grizzly, that he wouldn't need no disguise." End of Book 12, Chapter 5. Book 12, Chapter 6 of Round the Block by John Bell Bouton. This recording is in the public domain. Revelations of a Laugh. The carpenter here burst out with an extraordinary peal of laughter. It was so very peculiar, that once heard, it would always be identified with the person making it. This singular laugh consisted of a brilliant staccato passage on a high key, interrupted by several snorts, and terminating with a slur, which covered the whole descending octave. It was also very loud, and very long. It had the effect of bringing Mrs. Frump to the door. She thrust out her head, unseen by either the carpenter or Matthew, and looked at the former with a wondering air. "It was an odd idea," said Matthew, laughing slightly out of compliment to the carpenter, though he could not understand what there was to laugh at. "And now," continued he, when the carpenter's cachinnations had subsided, "I will explain to you my motive in asking all these questions. I am engaged to Mrs. Frump, and she is now—" The carpenter immediately broke into another of his remarkable laughs, louder and longer than before. "Well, sir," said Matthew sarcastically, "when you get through, perhaps you will be good enough to tell me what you are laughing about." "The idee of your marrying Mrs. And the remainder of the sentence was lost in that monstrous laugh. Matthew, irritated by this most aggravating species of ridicule, took the carpenter's measure for a kick, but judiciously refrained from fitting him with one. The second of the carpenter's laughs had made the widow, still stealthily looking out of the door, turn pale. The third had inspired her with a painful curiosity, which she had determined to gratify at any risk. Before the last laugh, she had therefore crept up unobserved near where Matthew and the carpenter were standing, with their backs toward her. Coming around suddenly in front of them, she saw the carpenter's mouth wide open, still in the act of laughing, and observed that one of his front teeth was out. The widow screamed, and fell into Matthew's arms, nearly flooring him. "Hold on to her," said the carpenter. "She will come to in a minute." "Who, sir? Who on earth are you?" shouted Matthew, struggling under the burdensome widow and a sense of mental bewilderment. "I am Amos Frump," he replied in a voice which had suddenly risen 5 notes. "The widow's husband! The dead come to life!" exclaimed Matthew, starting back, and nearly dropping the inanimate form. Astounded as he was, he did not forget the marital rights of the man before him, and he said, with a trembling voice, politely, "I beg your pardon, but, as you are this lady's husband, perhaps you had better hold her." "She appears to be doing very well where she is," replied the singularly calm Amos Frump. "A moment more, and she will be out of her fainting spell. I've seed her very often this way before." Mr. Frump's prediction was verified, for his lips had scarcely closed on the words, when Mrs. Frump opened her eyes, and feebly said, "Is it a dream?" "No, Gusty," replied the composed Amos. "It is a husband come back from Californy, with $50,000. It is my own husband's voice!" cried Mrs. Frump, throwing herself impulsively out of Matthew's arms upon the patched and faded coat of her restored consort. "I thought you would know the voice," said Amos, "and that's the reason I changed it into a growl. This 'ere old Californy suit was a pooty good disguise, too, but my confounded laugh betrayed me. I didn't think to change that." The third laugh had roused old Van Quintem from a nice nap, and he came out on the piazza. "Hallo, Mr. Carpenter! What are you doing there?" said he, good naturedly. A few words from the supposed carpenter defined his position, and threw old Van Quintem into the appropriate state of amazement. Looking at the shaggy face, by a variety of lights, he soon came to recognize it as that of his niece's husband, whom he had seen a few times on his yearly visits to the country, before his farming brother, Nicholas Van Quintem, father of Mrs. Frump, had died. "From the way Gusty hangs to you, I judge you are no ghost," said old Van Quintem, when he had partly recovered his senses. "No more than I am a carpenter," was the dry response. "But how does it happen that you are no ghost?" asked old Van Quintem, with fearful interest. This was what everybody wanted to know, and so Mr. Frump, supporting his wife by the waist, while she, apparently half stupefied, reposed her head on his shoulder, explained the mystery of his appearance. He had been severely injured in a drunken quarrel about a claim. He would not deny that, and, taking off his broad-brimmed hat, he showed the 2 deep scars extending from his eyebrows to the roots of his hair. He was left on the ground for dead, and his assailants ran away. The enterprising correspondent of 3 San Francisco papers saw him when he was first found, and learning that he would undoubtedly die, the enterprising correspondent regarded him as already sufficiently dead for newspaper purposes, and sent 3 thrilling accounts of his butchery, written up with ingenious variations, to the 3 journals of which he was the indefatigable special. In a few days, the nearly murdered man was out of danger. On learning that the news of his death had already been sent to the papers, the singular idea came into his mind to let the reports go uncontradicted, change his name, give up drinking, move away to some place where he was not known, and begin his miner's life over again. The special correspondent, on being consulted by him, assured Mr. Frump that he could depend on his, the correspondent's, silence, since it was his invariable practice never to take back or qualify any statement made by him, such a course being obviously fatal to his hard-earned reputation for accuracy. The correspondent also very obligingly supplied him with copies of the papers containing the circumstantial accounts of his death, which he directed in a disguised hand, and sent through the mail to his wife. He had then assumed another name, gone into Benicia County, was successful in gold digging, and after making about $2,000, had taken up his residence in the nearest village, undesignated, and had invested his money in speculations, kind not particularized. Fortune followed him, but he found it convenient, for certain reasons not given, to move away to another village in a few months. In fact, he had, within 4 years, made the entire circuit of California, never staying in one place more than a quarter of a year. "I don't want to brag," said Mr. Frump, "but it is well enough to have it understood that I made my pile." Mr. Frump nodded his head quietly, as one who does not lie. Old Van Quintem had hitherto hesitated to congratulate Mrs. Frump upon the reacquisition of her husband. He now advanced, and shook her warmly by the hand. "I wish you joy," said he. "And you too, Mr. Frump. I never had the pleasure of meeting you often, though I had frequently heard of you. With regard to those unpleasant family difficulties in which you became involved, they are now at an end, for Gusty's parents are both dead, and the old house and farm are sold. Let bygones be bygones." "So say I, Mr. Van Quintem," said Mr. Frump, grasping the extended hand. "As for my wife's relatives, I'm sure I allers forgave 'em. As for the old house and farm, if you like, Gusty, we'll buy it back agin." Mrs. Frump, still resting on her husband's shoulder, sobbed a little, and clung closer about him. "Here is one friend of the family," continued Amos, in his pleasantest manner, pointing to Matthew, "whom I don't know by name, though we've scraped an off-hand 'quaintance." "Mr. Frump, Matthew Maltboy, Esquire," said old Van Quintem. Matthew, like Mrs. Frump, had fully appreciated the awkwardness of his situation, and had kept a rigid silence since the returned Californian resumed possession of his wife. The minute after Mr. Frump's identity had been established, Matthew could have hugged him with ecstasy; but having lost the widow, his fickle mind straightway began to discover in her a great many excellencies that he had never seen before. Therefore, when he submitted his hand to the grip of Mr. Frump, his face expressed a strangely mingled joy and regret. "I like you," said Mr. Frump, "and as soon as wifey and I commence housekeepin' agin, I'll expect lots o' visits from you. Whenever I'm not at home, wifey'll make everything comfortable. Won't you, dear?" "If you wish it," replied Mrs. Frump, looking up into his face, which was not a repulsive one, "for your word shall always be my law." "I must say," said Matthew, his face exhibiting unqualified admiration for Mr. Frump, "that you are the most generous man I ever met; and if Mrs. Frump will promise to introduce me to some nice young woman that she could recommend for a wife, perhaps I'll accept your invitation." "I'll get you a wife in less than a week," said Mrs. F., who was rejoiced that the interview between her recovered husband and late suitor had ended peacefully. "But one thing you haven't yet explained, Amos," said old Van Quintem. "How did you get into Crumley's employment?" "Bless your innocent heart, I am not. I arrived this mornin' in the steamer , straight from Aspinwall, with this old scarecrow suit on, just as you see me now. I was intendin' to take the railroad for Tioga County, and play off a leetle surprise on Gusty and her relations up there. But before goin', it 'curred to me to call in on a Mr. Lambkin, who was raised in Tioga, and keeps a grocery store in the lower part of Washington Street. I found Mr. Lambkin in, and he told me as how, accordin' to last accounts, Gusty was stayin' with her Uncle Van Quintem. I knowed your address, and come up here short meter. I was goin' to pretend that I was a man in search of work, and trust to luck to get a sight of Gusty. I found your front door open, and walked through the entry to the back parlor, where you fust see me standin'. Afore I could ask you for any work, you wanted to know if I hadn't been sent to mend your piazza railing. It was easy to say yes, and I said it." "And very well you carried out the joke, Amos," said old Van Quintem. "You wouldn't make a bad actor." "Rather better actor than carpenter, I guess," said Mr. Frump. "Perhaps so," said old Van Quintem; "but a financier of your talent needn't act, or mend railings for a living. I should like to know, now, how you made your money in California. 9 out of 10 who go there come back poorer than they went." "'Tisn't best to ask too many questions of a returned Californian," answered Amos, in perfect good humor, "nor of anybody else, about business matters." "You are right," added old Van Quintem. "I say to wifey, and to all my friends, let bygones be bygones. Take me as you find me, and I'll take you as I find you, and we'll ax no questions on either side." "Dear Amos, you are the best of husbands," said Mrs. Frump, looking fondly in his face. Mr. Frump improved as he was looked at. "Let bygones be bygones is a very good rule," said old Van Quintem. "Mr. Frump," said Matthew, unable longer to repress the compliment, "you have a wonderful amount of good sense." "I told you," was the laughing reply, "that Amos was sensible in some things." Book 12, Chapter 6. Book 13, Chapter 1 of Round the Block by John Bell Bouton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 13th. The Strange Lady. Chapter 1. A Story of the Past. Another year slipped away, and wrought many changes among the inhabitants of the block. Some of them had passed from stately mansions to those narrow houses which are appointed for all the living. Others had wedded, and moved to other blocks which were to be their future homes, till the 1st of the following May. Some of them had grown rich by quick speculations, and got into the choicest society by the simple maneuver of taking a 4-story brownstone front in the avenue which formed the eastern boundary of the block. Others had attained to poverty by the same process, and had migrated to cheaper lodgings in blocks remote, expecting that a lucky turn of Fortune's wheel would bring them back to fashionable life next year, as it most likely would. The principal personages of this story had been radically affected by this lapse of time, as will hereafter be shown, with the single exception of Marcus Wilkeson. For 1 year, life had passed tranquilly, uneventfully. He had sought and found in his dear books a panacea for that sickness of the heart which sometimes attacked him in his lonelier hours. At such times he would repeat to himself these expressive lines of an old poet: "This books can do, nor this alone. They give new views of life, and teach us how to live. The grieved they soothe, the stubborn they chastise, fools they admonish, and confirm the wise. Their aid they yield to all. They never shun the man of sorrow, or the wretch undone. Unlike the hard, the selfish, and the proud, they fly not sullen from the suppliant crowd, nor tell to various people various things, but show to subjects what they show to kings." The end of the quiet, sad, but not unpleasantly sad, 12 months found Marcus, on a bright morning in the month of August, sitting at his window with a favorite book on his knees, looking, where he should not have looked so much, at that window in the old house where the only tragedy of his life had been wrought. As he gazed, like one fascinated by a spell, his features lengthened, and the habitual melancholy expression of his face became deepened and confirmed. So wrapped was he in these unhappy self-communings, that he did not hear a vigorous rat-tat-tat on the door of the little back parlor. A repetition of the performance aroused him, and to his call, "Come in," Mash, the cook, presented herself. "A woman at the door wishes to speak to you, sir, on important business, she says. Shall I show her in, sir?" Mash laid stress on the word woman, in retaliation for the somewhat peremptory way in which the person in question had accosted her at the door. The buttery and the boudoir, a tale of real life, afforded her a precedent on this point. "Show in the lady," said Marcus, wondering who she could be. A tall, shapely person, dressed in deep black, and wearing a thick veil, was ushered into the room. She bowed slightly and took a seat which Marcus offered her near the window, and then looked significantly at Mash, who lingered in an uncertain way about the door. "You may shut the door, Mash," said Marcus, and Mash did so with a little slam, intended to pierce the heart of the mysterious woman in black, for whom that domestic had, in 1 minute, conceived a mortal dislike. The strange woman drew back her veil, and revealed a thin, pale face, which might have been handsome 20 years back. "Do you remember having seen me before?" Marcus looked into the thin face with polite scrutiny. "Yes, madam," said he at length. "I think I saw you on a railway train in New Jersey, over a year ago, and also in the town of , in that state, on the evening of a certain unfortunate exhibition. But you are changed, in some respects, since then. You would say that I am paler and thinner, and I am here to tell you why I am, and also to make all the atonement in my power for a crime that I have committed." Marcus Wilkeson's first thought was of the unfathomed murder. His startled face expressed what was passing through his mind. The strange woman read his thoughts. "The crime to which I refer is not the murder of Mr. Minford, of which I may here say I believed from the first that you were entirely innocent. Crimes of that character, at least, have never been known in your family. All that you say, taken in connection with some curious circumstances which occurred in that railway ride, and that memorable night in New Jersey," said Marcus, "make me intensely anxious to hear what you have to tell. Please impart the information at once, and fully. I call Heaven to witness that your name, your history, the secret which you are to reveal, shall pass with me to the grave, if you desire it." "I accept your offer," said she with emotion, "though my crime is so flagrant that no publicity, no punishment would be too great for it. Still, as full justice can be done, and reparation made, without this public disgrace, I prefer that my identity should be unknown, except to you. I think that I have but few months to live." The woman expelled a hacking cough. "My story must be short," said she, "and suited to my strength and this cough. You probably remember Lucy Anserhoff, who was a little playmate of yours in your native village. I see by your nod that you do. I am she. You may well look surprised, for there is little in my haggard face and wasted form to recall that once innocent girl. You remember, I presume, my engagement to your brother Aurelius. Excuse my faltering, sir, for even at this distance of time, I cannot speak of your dead brother without emotion. It is not necessary to recall to your memory the details of your brother's conduct to me, and how he afterward married another, and moved to this city. This early portion of my unfortunate career is well known to you, as it was to all the people of our little village." Here the strange visitor paused and coughed. The cough was dry and hollow. She continued, "I think I may say that I was amiable and good enough as a child, but your brother's desertion changed my whole nature. I dwelt upon one thought revenge. I shudder as I confess it, but for months I meditated taking the life of the man who had wronged me. I came to this city twice and lay in wait for him, but my heart faltered, and, thank God, I did not commit that crime. Soon Heaven interposed, so it seemed to me at that wicked time, to help on my work of vengeance. Your brother's wife died, giving birth to a female child. I used to ride into the city twice a week regularly after this, and watch for him near his place of business, that I might gloat on his pale, unhappy face. I see the look of horror with which you receive this part of my confession. But you will bear in mind, sir, that I am here to tell the truth, concealing nothing. You remember, sir, the old lines about a woman scorned. I, sir, can bear witness to their awful truth." Another fit of coughing here interrupted her. At length she resumed, in a feebler voice, "I must hasten while I can talk at all. One day, while I was watching near your brother's house for his appearance, the door opened, and a servant appeared with a child in her arms, his child. The servant walked down the street, and I followed her, unobserved, until she came to Washington Parade Ground. She entered the park and took a seat near the fountain. I sat down on a bench near her. It was not long before I made the girl's acquaintance, and had the child in my arms, caressing it with well counterfeited kindness. Suddenly the girl recollected that she had left the street door of the house unlocked, and was afraid that the house, having not a soul in it, would be robbed during her absence. She was so much troubled about it, that she asked me to hold the child, then about a year old, until she could go and lock up the house and return. A horrible suggestion came into my mind, and I took the child in my arms. The servant was no sooner out of my sight than I rose, and, clasping the child tightly, walked rapidly in the opposite direction. When I got out of the park, among the side streets near North River, I ran until I was tired, turning at every corner to avoid pursuit. My plan was clear from the moment that the child was left in my charge. It was to give her into the keeping of some stranger, and so rob the widowed father of his only child. It was a scheme worthy of the lost and wretched woman that I then was. A fit of coughing here set in, interrupting the narrative for several minutes. Marcus offered his strange guest a glass of water. She sipped it until her cough was checked. "I wished to make a full and minute statement, sir, but this cough again warns me to be very brief. In a word, then, I had not gone far before I saw a German woman, a neat, elderly person, sitting on the stoop of her house. An impulse moved me to leave the child with her. I accosted her, but she answered me in German, saying that she could not speak English. Hardly knowing what I did, I mounted the steps and placed the child in her arms, first kissing it. Then I tossed my pocketbook, containing about $20, into her lap, and without another word or act, ran off again. As I drew near the next corner, I turned and saw the German woman still sitting on the stoop, looking at the child, and then at the money, and then at my flying form, in perfect amazement. Well, I returned to my country home in safety. Next day I saw in the New York papers a reward of $500 for the recovery of the child, and the same amount for the arrest of the woman who stole it. My person was described, according to the recollection of the servant, but so imperfectly that I could not be identified. In 2 weeks I visited the city again, found the house where I had left the child, for I had remembered, even in my haste, the street and the number. The poor little thing was well, and had learned to love its new mother, who in turn seemed to love it as well as her own two children. I kissed the child, left more money with the German woman, and fled again to my home. These visits I repeated from week to week for 6 months, without detection. The German woman supposed that I was the mother of the child, but knew there was a secret, and did not seek to disturb it. At the end of the 6 months, your brother died." There was here a slight quaver in her voice, almost instantly passing away. "Soon after this, my mother died, and the last of our family estate was spent on her burial." Another tremor in the voice, but brief. The woman seemed to have perfect control of her feelings. "Fortunately, I was qualified to earn my living as a seamstress. I went to the city, advertised for such a place, and obtained it. I visited the child secretly, sometimes, and left money for its support and clothing, but the idea of detection and exposure troubled me greatly. One day, I read an advertisement from a married couple who had no children, offering to adopt a girl under 2 years of age. I answered the advertisement, and thus became acquainted with—" "I anticipate the disclosure," said Marcus. "Mr. Minford. And the poor, dear child is my niece. Heaven be praised! She is found at last." End of Book 13, Chapter 1. Book 13, Chapter 2 of Round the Block by John Bell Bouton. This recording is in the public domain. Possible love. You have guessed rightly. Miss Minford is your niece. The proofs will be found in this packet. They are articles of clothing, taken from the child as fast as new ones were supplied, to prevent its identification, bearing the initials of Helen Wilkeson. I preserved them with the vague idea of benefiting her by them some day. I have seen the child by stealth a few times since I gave her to Mr. and Mrs. Minford, but never called at their house. It was agreed between us that I should never make myself known as the child's mother, and that they should never seek to learn my name and history. I acted as seamstress in several families in this city, until about 5 years ago I obtained an engagement in a family in New Jersey, living in the very town where that unlucky panorama was exhibited. It happened, as you know, that you and I rode in the same car from New York, where I had been on a shopping excursion. I recognized and was profoundly impressed with your resemblance to your brother. Learning that you were connected with the panorama, I attended the exhibition, that I might observe you more closely. There you were arrested on the charge of murdering Mr. Minford, of which I again say, I always believed you were totally innocent. You may remember that a woman fainted away. I was she. The sudden recollection of those two names, Wilkeson and Minford, in such a connection, was too much even for my nerves. I read the trial with fearful interest, and rejoiced in your release from the accusation. Providence at last seemed to point out the way to make all the reparation for my crime. I should have done it immediately after your acquittal, had I not seen by the papers that a wealthy lady, Mrs. Crull, had given your niece a home in her family. I postponed this act of justice from 1 week to another, until my failing health warned me that it could not be put off with safety longer. I thank Heaven that I have had strength and resolution to do it at last." "This act of atonement, madam," said Marcus, "entitles you to my respect and sympathy. If you ever need a friend, I trust you will do me the favor of calling on me." "I thank you," she replied, "but I have means enough to support me for the remainder of my days, which are numbered." The family in which I live, little knowing my true history, are very kind to me." The protracted conversation had not been closed too soon. A violent cough seized upon the poor woman's frame, and shook it like a leaf. When it had ceased, Marcus observed that her lips were streaked with blood. He begged to send for a doctor, but she would not have one, and rose to take her leave. Marcus insisted, however, upon ordering a carriage for her conveyance to the New Jersey Railroad depot, and she at length consented to receive that kindness from him. To the driver he whispered words of caution, and instructed him to take the lady to a physician, in case she was ill on the journey, and if so, to report immediately thereafter to him. He then shook her hand frankly, and begged her again to remember that he should always be her friend. She smiled sadly as she replied, "Again and again I thank you, sir, but it is useless to accept your kind offers, for we are meeting for the last time." The carriage was driven slowly away. The poor woman's words were true, and Marcus never saw her more. End of Book 13, Chapter 2. Book 13, Chapter 3 of Round the Block by John Bell Bouton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Uncle and Niece. Marcus Wilkeson had seen Pet but twice since the inquest. Once in Mrs. Crull's carriage, and once afoot, on the opposite side of the street. He was delicately conscious that she regarded him with distrust or aversion, and, raising his hat politely to her, bowed and passed on. He had expressly enjoined upon Tiffles and Overtop, in the communications which they had with her relative to the Cosmopolitan window fastener, not to mention his name. He shrank from appearing to force himself on her notice. The discovery of her real parentage had modified Marcus's sensitiveness somewhat. He was now no longer in the ridiculous position of a middle-aged, hopeless lover, but was an uncle, with a charming niece whom he could honorably love like a father. His first impulse, after the departure of the mysterious woman, was to hurry around to Mrs. Crull's house, unpack his bundle of proofs, and embrace the dear child with avuncular affection. Upon him, glowing with this impulse, came the calm, deep Overtop, to whom Marcus told the strange story. Overtop listened with lawyer-like composure, and, when Marcus had finished, asked for the bundle. "The story is likely enough," said he, "but a lawyer wants to know all the proofs." So saying, he removed from the parcel the string which had bound it, and which, with the wrapping cloth, had become yellow with age, and brought to view a baby's long frock, and a cap made of the finest materials, and heavily fringed with lace, and a pair of tarnished golden morocco shoes of fairy dimensions. Upon an edge of the dress were daintily wrought in needlework the initials H.W. A separate package contained extracts from 3 daily papers, giving accounts of the mysterious disappearance of a child, and an advertisement, signed Aurelius Wilkeson, offering $500 for the recovery of his daughter Helen, and describing the circumstances of the abduction, so far as they were known, and the articles of dress which the infant wore at the time. "So far, so good," said Overtop. "But it now remains to identify the original owner of these baby clothes with Miss Minford. We must find some old friends or acquaintances of the late inventor, who can testify that he adopted a child during the year 18 . Marcus, whose memory was tenacious of names, recollected that Mr. Minford, in his few confidential moments, had told him of several persons whom he had known in more prosperous days. With these memoranda to guide him, Overtop went resolutely to work, and in 2 days found 4 old friends of Mr. and Mrs. Minford, who remembered the very year when they adopted an infant child. It was the same year that the daughter of Aurelius Wilkeson had disappeared. Overtop, being a notary public, took the affidavits of these persons as he went along. Here Overtop would have stopped, and left Marcus to break the important news of his new-found relationship to the young lady. But Marcus, who had a perfect horror of scenes, begged his friend to do this troublesome piece of diplomacy for him, but promised, when it was done, to appear at Mrs. Crull's in his new character of uncle. Overtop performed the difficult task with success. He found Pet not altogether unprepared for the discovery. She recalled to mind several conversations and significant glances between Mr. and Mrs. Minford (the latter died in Pet's 12th year), in which there was an evident allusion to the mystery of her birth. She remembered how often persons had expressed surprise that she did not resemble her supposed father or mother in the least. She remembered that, on those occasions, Mrs. Minford had been much disconcerted, and Mr. Minford, remarking that it was a freak of nature, he presumed, had always seemed desirous of changing the subject. She remembered that this strange want of resemblance to either of her reputed parents had often been a puzzle to her before Mrs. Minford's death. With regard to Lucy Anserhoff, and the causes which prompted her to the abduction of the child, Overtop said nothing, because, among other reasons, Marcus, true to his solemn pledge, had told him nothing. He explained that the crime had been committed by a person who had formerly been a servant in her father's family, and that she had made full confession to her uncle, only on condition that her name should never be mentioned to any human being. Mrs. Crull, who, to a practical mind, united a love of the romantic and marvelous, accepted Overtop's proofs even more readily than Pet. She said she had observed, at the inquest, a wonderful resemblance between Mr. Wilkeson and her darling, especially in the nose and eyes. Overtop, being appealed to mark the likeness, took an oracular three-quarters view of the young lady, and said that the word niece was written on her face. "He's your uncle, my dear," said Mrs. Crull. "There ain't no doubt of that. But don't forget that I'm your mother now." Pet kissed Mrs. Crull, and placed her little hand confidingly in the large, ineradicably red hand of her protectress. "Now that Marcus Wilkeson stands in the relation of uncle to you," said Overtop, "there is no harm in telling you something." He then broke to her the secret of her uncle's important aid in the affair of the Cosmopolitan window fastener, the sole credit of which had always been attributed by Pet and Mrs. Crull to Wesley Tiffles and Overtop, agreeably to the wish of Marcus. "What a fool I've been," said Mrs. Crull, "to feel the least doubt about this excellent man. It was very weak of me, I s'pose, Mr. Overtop; but I don't mind tellin' you, that, after what had 'curred, I thought that Mr. Wilkeson's 'quaintance with Pet had better be stopped. I take all the 'sponsibility of it. We must make it up by thinkin' all the more of him now." At the suggestion of Overtop, a servant with Mrs. Crull's carriage was now sent for Marcus, and soon returned with him. When he entered the room, Pet rose and walked toward him, half hesitating. Her face was very pale, and her lips quivered. "My dear uncle," she said, and turned her sweet face up to be kissed. Marcus, to whom the probable character of his reception had been a distressing subject of conjecture, was delighted at this frank, affectionate greeting, and stooped and imprinted an uncle's kiss on the young girl's brow. It was a pleasant way out of an embarrassment. The conflicting emotions of the hour were too much for Pet, and she tottered to Mrs. Crull's arms, and wept for a few moments. "You are her uncle, Mr. Wilkeson," said Mrs. Crull, extending her red right hand, while with her left she smoothed Pet's thick brown hair. "But I am her mother. Mrs. Crull seized upon this early opportunity to give notice that her rights as adopted parent were not to be abridged. "And happy she is in having such a mother, my dear Mrs. Crull," said Marcus. A quick ring, as of a familiar visitor, was heard at the door. The servant ushered in Bog. He was much changed since his last presentation to the reader. 6 months of worldly polish, of private tutoring, and of a strong desire to appear well in the eyes of one he loved, had turned the clumsy boy into the quiet but stylish young gentleman. He had given up the bill posting business, not because he was sick of it or ashamed of it, but because old Van Quintem loved his adopted son so well that he could not spare him from his side. Bog passed the greater portion of every day with him, rambling through the streets, or riding in the suburbs in the old family carriage, or reading the dear old books to him. Bog read well now, and had learned to love those repositories of wit and wisdom with almost as keen a relish as the venerable white-headed listener. This was another bond of affection between the old gentleman and himself. At Bog's entrance, Pet looked up, and showed the sparkling tears in her eyes. A deep shade of anxiety passed over the young man's face, and he looked around for an explanation. The prompt Overtop was ready to give it, and in a few moments Bog was enlightened with the great discovery. "And Pet has been crying a little because she is so happy. That's all," added Mrs. Crull. "Sit down here, Bog." Mrs. Crull made room for him on the other end of the sofa where she was sitting, her left hand still smoothing the soft brown hair of her adopted child. Bog took the seat, and smiled across the good lady's broad figure to Pet, who smiled back at him again. This expressive exchange of glances was not lost on Marcus. He instantly saw, what he had not divined before, that the devotion, the self-sacrifice, the constant unswerving love of the boy, had at last sounded its echo in the bosom of the maiden. As he swiftly contrasted the manly, athletic figure of the young man with the delicate beauty of his niece, he thought how well they were adapted to each other, and wondered that he could ever have been so blind and conceited as to suppose that a nervous old bachelor like himself could win the heart of that fresh and youthful image of loveliness. And how thankful he then was that he had never, by a single word, hinted at the mad love which he once felt for her. He had no cause to blush now. End of Book 13, Chapter 3. Book 14, Chapter 1 of Round the Block by John Bell BOUTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 14th. Happy Days. Chapter 1. Owners of the Beautiful. The world and all its inhabitants had rolled round to another fragrant spring. The buds were bursting in city parks and gardens, and birds twittered in the dusty air. Every happy heart said to itself, "This green and these opening roses, this music of the birds, this shining day, this temperate breeze, all are mine, and made for me." There were two young persons, one sweet morning in May, who experienced a delightful sense of that universal proprietorship of the beautiful. They were a couple who appeared to be expressly made for each other, for the young man was tall and broad-chested, the young woman short and delicately formed. His eyes were black, hers blue. He was calm, resolute, deliberate in every movement, she quick and impulsive. There never was a clearer case of mutual fitness by virtue of entire dissimilarity. Any one could see that they loved each other, and that, if they were not married, they were engaged, for her little hand was entwined most trustingly about his muscular arm, and she leaned toward him with that gentle inclination which seems to be a magnetism of the heart. "Are you happy, my own pet?" asked the young man, looking proudly down at the beautiful face beside him. "Happy? Dear Bog, for I will always call you Bog. You know I am." Her blue eyes filled with tears. If excess of happiness had not choked her voice, she would have asked Bog if he thought she could be other than perfectly happy in the love of her adopted mother, in the love of her dear uncle, who was at once a father and brother in his tender solicitudes, in the love of that darling old gentleman, Myndert Van Quintem, and in one other love, which it was not necessary to mention. But Bog knew that she was supremely happy, and he needed no such elaborate answer. He also knew that he possessed the first fresh and only love that she had ever cherished. All the events in connection with her Greenpoint adventure, both before and after it, proved that she had never loved young Van Quintem, and that her sentiments toward him were only those of gratitude for his supposed saving of her life, and an innocent, childlike confidence in his good intentions. The lovers sauntered down the street slowly, as if they would protract the walk. Not another word was said. Passing a garden full of roses, Bog reached through the fence and plucked a full-blown white one, and handed it to Pet. She eagerly took it, and pinned it to the bosom of her dress. "Here we are, dearest, and I am almost ashamed to show myself to uncle, for I am such a stranger," said Bog, breaking the silence, as they stood at the foot of the memorable bell tower. "Hallo, Uncle Ith!" he shouted, looking upward. The old gentleman thrust his white head out of an open window at the top, and said, "All right, come up." The door at the foot of the tower was open, and the young couple proceeded to comply with the invitation. Bog led the way, and gently dragged Pet from step to step, with much laughter on his part, and many charming little feminine screams on her part, until the trap door was reached. Uncle Ith had combed his hair with his 5 fingers, retied his old black cravat, and put on his coat to receive them. He smiled through the trap door as they came in sight, and said, "Be very careful of the young lady, Bog. Mind, now, how the young lady steps." Bog jumped through the trap door into the cupola. Then he lowered a hand to Pet, and Uncle Ith lent her the same assistance, and the two raised the precious burden to a place of safety. Uncle Ith, after he had been introduced to Pet, proudly, by his nephew, looked at her for a moment in silent admiration. He had never seen her before, but he knew her well from Bog's descriptions, hurriedly communicated by Bog when they had met in the street, and said to himself that the boy had done no more than justice to her rare beauty. Then Uncle Ith looked at his nephew. "Ah, Bog," said he, shaking his head at him, "what changes time does make! It seems only a few days ago that you was a little scrub of a chap, runnin' round town, and pickin' up your livin', and a very good and honest livin' you picked up, too. Now, here you are, a nicely dressed, tall, handsome young man, with a snug little fortin all of your own earnin', not to mention your bein' the adopted son of that splendid old gentleman, Myndert Van Quintem. And last and best, you are goin' to be married to this dear young lady to morrer." Pet blushed, and Bog said, "That is why we are here to day, dear uncle. We must have you at the wedding." Uncle Ith faltered. "Me at Mr. Van Quintem's? I should feel like a fish out o' water." He said nothing about the antiquated blue coat with brass buttons, the short black trousers, and the figured satin vest hanging up in a closet at home. But he thought of them, and what a stiff figure he would cut in them. "But you must come, Uncle Ith," said Pet, with her sweetest smile. "I ask it as a particular favor. You are my only living relative, you know, uncle," added Bog. "We should not be happy if you were away," said Pet, placing her hand confidingly on the old man's shoulder. Young persons always took to the good old man in this spontaneous way. The entreaties of the couple, and the continual iteration of that name by which he loved to be called, Uncle Ith, finally overcame his objections. He reconciled himself to the prospect of the blue coat, short trousers, and gaudy vest, and solemnly promised to attend the wedding. This important matter having been settled, Uncle Ith pointed out to Pet all the interesting objects to be seen from the tower, and adjusted the spyglass for her, and gave her near views of Governor's Island, the Palisades, and other remote objects. He also explained to her the process of striking the bell by means of the long iron lever, and told her that, if she would wait there long enough, she could hear how the big chap sounded 10 feet away. Pet put her hands to her ears in anticipation of the stunning noise, and laughingly said that she didn't think she would wait long. End of Book 14, Chapter 1. Book 14, Chapter 2 of Round the Block by John Bell BOUTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Last of a Mystery. After Pet had looked at all the objects of interest visible from the bell tower, Uncle Ith pointing them out with the pride of an owner, Bog called Pet aside, and said, "Now, Uncle Ith, I have something to show her that I used to think most interesting of all." Pet rested her hand upon his arm, and gazed through the southeastern window in the direction indicated by Bog's forefinger. "Right there," said he, "midway between those 2 tall chimneys, and a trifle south of the line of that steeple. The last 2 windows in the upper story of that old house. Do you see them?" Pet looked along his outstretched arm, to get the precise direction, and then said hurriedly, "It is my old home." The sight of those familiar windows, in which the calico curtains still hung, recalled the horrid vision of that dreadful night. Pet turned pale, and shuddered. "Let us look elsewhere, Bog," said she. "I beg your pardon, dearest, but I wanted to tell you how many hours I had spent in this cupola, day and night, gazing at those 2 windows, and feeling, oh, so happy if I could but catch a glimpse of you or your shadow." But I never told Uncle Ith about it. Uncle Ith had not overheard this conversation, but he had followed with his eyes the direction pointed out by Bog. As the young couple stepped back from the window, he said, "I see some strange sights occasionally, my children." He was fond of calling young people his children. "I can tell you. There are a couple of windows in the upper story of that old brick house, between the 2 big chimneys, that used to interest me some." "We see them," said Bog and Pet. "About 5 years back I began to notice lights burnin' in that room, long after all other lights, except the street lamps, were put out. Of course, this attracted my attention, and I used to feel a kind of queer pleasure in looking into that room with my spyglass, and wonderin' what was goin' on there. The curtains were usually drawn over the lower sashes, but this tower bein' 50 or 60 feet higher than the house, I could look over the top of the curtains, and see somethin'. An old man, tall and slim, and a young girl, 'peared to be the only folks that lived there." "Are you sick, young lady?" said he, observing that Pet looked pale. "Oh, no, I am not sick, only a little fatigued. What a brute I was not to offer you a chair. Now do sit down, young lady." Pet did so, and Uncle Ith resumed. "The old gentleman was a machinist, I s'pose, for I used to see his shadow on the wall, goin' through the motions of filin', sawin', and hammerin', though I could never guess what he was workin' on. I have known him sometimes to be at this queer business till daylight. For 3 years the strange old gentleman never missed a night at his work. I fear you are not quite well, young lady. Take a glass of water." Pet sipped from the proffered glass, and declared that she was much better now. "One night, about 2 years ago, I took a look into this room with my spyglass. I generally didn't do it until 3 or 4 o'clock in the mornin', when all the other lights in the neighborhood was out. But on that partickler night, about 11 o'clock, I happened to observe that one of the window curtains which covered the lower sash was left partly undrawn. This had never occurred before, and so I brought my glass to bear on the room at once. A tall gentleman, whose face I had often seen movin' in the room over the top of the curtain, was just in the act of takin' his departure, which he did without shakin' hands. The old man then went to his place at the other window, and tackled to his work again. He had been at it about 20 minutes, when a bar or rod, which stuck up above the curtain, and was somehow connected with his work, fell forward with a quick motion, as if it was jerked away. The old man stooped, picked it up, and fixed it in its place again. His face, as well as I could see through my glass in the night time, at that distance, showed a wonderful amount of surprise and astonishment at the fall of this rod or bar, I suppose. He then seemed to be filin' on somethin', and afterward stooped down, as if to put it into some part of the machine, or whatever it was. Jest at that minute, the post office struck, and I put down my glass, and turned my head toward the sound, to catch the district. It struck 7. I jumped to the lever, and started the old bell for 7 too. As I was strikin' the first round, my eyes happened to rest on the strange window again. The old man was not standin' there. The bar or rod had fallen out of its place again, I s'posed, and I expected every minute to see the old man appear at the window and fix it again. But he didn't show himself any more that night, and, which is the curious part of my story, I've never seen him since. Whether he dropped dead from heart disease, I can't guess, but certain I am that he is dead, for poor Pet here exhibited such signs of faintness, that Bog, who had been leaning against the edge of the window, gazing at the well-known window with a strange fascination, sprang to her side, and instantly bathed her brow with water from Uncle Ith's old pitcher, near at hand. This restored her. "Be calm, dearest," said Bog. What is the matter with the young lady?" asked Uncle Ith, in great trepidation. "Shall I run for a doctor?" "No, Uncle Ith, no doctor. But we won't talk any more about this strange room at present. It affects Miss Wilkeson's nerves." "The shock is past, dear Bog," said she, "and I can bear to hear everything." "But you must promise to control yourself, darling," said Bog, tenderly. "One question, Uncle Ith," said he. "How long a time were your eyes off the room, after the first strike of the 7th District?" "Not more than 3 seconds." "And you are sure that there was nobody in the room?" "Certain, for I must have seen him enter or go out." "Then, Uncle Ith, you have cleared up a great mystery." "What? What mystery?" "The death of Mr. Minford, the inventor, my old friend and the protector and guardian of Miss Wilkeson. He lived in that very room. He was at work on a perpetual motion machine. It was operated somehow by weights. It started suddenly, when you saw that rod or lever fall to the floor. Mr. Minford put the rod in its place, and made some little improvement in the works. The machine started again at a moment when your eyes were turned away. The rod fell with greater violence, struck the inventor on the head, and killed him. That is the whole story, and stupid we have all been not to have guessed it before." Nature furnished her own sweet relief to Pet's pent-up emotions. She burst into tears. "Thank Heaven!" said she. "It is all plain now." Pet had not whispered it to Mrs. Crull, or Bog, or her uncle, or to any other living soul; but the mystery of that awful night had hung over her young mind like a pall, which in vain she had tried to lift. "What a blockhead I am!" cried Uncle Ith, "not to take the papers. If I had only taken the papers, now, I should ha' read all about that affair, and might ha' guessed that the man who was s'posed to be murdered was the man I had seen workin' in that room for 3 years. Then I should ha' offered myself as a witness, and might ha' thrown some light on the business. I'll scribe for a paper to day, instead of trustin' to hearsay for the news." "And a very neglectful fellow was I," said Bog, "not to have called here and seen you, after that sad affair. But the truth was, that Pet went to live with her best of friends, Mrs. Crull, and I had no longer a desire to look at the room from your bell tower. In fact," Bog added, with a smile, "the tower has not been quite as interesting for 2 years past as it used to be. If I had come up here at any time since Mr. Minford's death, I should probably have told you of the supposed murder, and pointed out those windows to you. But you forgot all about your old uncle. Ha! I understand. Well, I forgive you, seein' what there was to 'sturb your recollections." Uncle Ith looked affectionately at Pet, who smiled and blushed through her tears. The old man continued: "I 'member once when we met in the street, about 2 years ago. I used to come round this way, you must know, Uncle Ith, in order to meet you 2 or 3 times a week. I give you credit for that, Bog. You never disowned your poor old uncle. But, as I was sayin', I 'member one time when we met, that you told me somethin' about the murder of somebody of your 'quaintance. But I didn't take no partic'lar interest in it, because I didn't know any of the parties concerned. And, of course, I didn't dream that poor Mr. Minford was the man I had seen workin' away there for 3 years. But the main fault is mine, because I don't take the papers. I see now that every man ought to take the papers, if only as a duty to his feller man." Uncle Ith coughed, as one who utters a maxim of great moral depth. It was then agreed, at Bog's suggestion, that Uncle Ith, accompanied by him, should call at Overtop's office, at early business hours, when Uncle Ith was off duty, next day, and consult upon the best course to be adopted to make his testimony public, and set the mystery of Mr. Minford's death for ever at rest. This having been done, Bog and Pet withdrew, and had hardly reached the foot of the tower, when the musical thunder of the great bell announced the constantly reiterated story of a fire in the 7th, that most combustible of all the city districts. End of Book 14, Chapter 2. Book 14, Chapter 3 of Round the Block by John Bell Bouton. This recording is in the public domain. Love Crowned. Late on a fair afternoon of May, wedding guests began to assemble at old Van Quintem's house. The old gentleman had been out of society many years, and he improved this happy occasion to bring together his few remaining relatives, and friends of his former business days. Heavy antique carriages rolled up to the door, with retired merchants and their wives. The retired merchants were of a pattern not altogether extinct in New York, who, at the ages of 60 years and upward, had cleared their skirts of business and settled down to a calm retrospect of the past, and serene anticipations of the future. They were evidently destined for a good old age, and had fat pocketbooks to help them through. The proper place to look for this class of retired merchants is on the tax books, and not in public assemblies, or among the directing boards of benevolent institutions. They are good, charitable souls, but having got out of business, they desire to keep out of it literally, leaving to a younger generation the task of managing men and affairs. A more stylish vehicle deposited at the door a bachelor bank president, who was not only the old personal friend of the host, but his trusted adviser in business affairs. The parlor of the Bank was one of the few places that old Van Quintem still visited in the bustling haunts of the city, and to old Van Quintem's house the bachelor bank president made monthly pilgrimages of friendship. He was a handsome man of 50, with long white hair, which matched beautifully with his yet ruddy cheeks, and a figure portly and full of strength. Nobody but himself knew why so eligible a man remained a bachelor. In a humpbacked chaise drawn by an exemplary horse, there rode a fat and pleasant old gentleman, who was uncomfortably swathed about the neck with a white cravat. He crawled from his narrow coupe with the nimbleness of one who is on professional business. He was followed by his wife, a little woman, who was the mother of 10 children from 2 to 20 years of age, just 2 years apart, and all strongly resembling their father. This fat, pleasant old gentleman was the old-fashioned minister of the old-fashioned church to which Mr. Van Quintem had belonged for 40 years. The little woman was his second wife, and there was a first crop of children, who had been safely launched on the world for many years, and were doing extremely well. The sole surviving relatives of old Van Quintem were 3 elderly ladies, who, by some contagious fatality, remained unmarried. After pining romantically over their doom for some time, they had settled down to the conviction that they were much happier single than wedded, and that they had escaped a great many dangers and disappointments, which was unquestionably true. It was really pleasant for them to reflect that the snug property which their father left them had not been squandered upon designing husbands, but had been kept, improved, and added to, until it was one of the prettiest estates on Staten Island. These ladies were first cousins of old Van Quintem, and had an odd habit of staying at home. They came to New York always on important business, which could not be transacted by any one else, 4 times a year, and on those occasions paid state visits to old Van Quintem, who reciprocated the civility by calling on them, in a ceremonial way, twice every summer. Uncle Ith came on foot, and wore his old blue coat with brass buttons, his flowered vest and shining trousers so awkwardly that people who did not know him stared at him as at a strange spectacle. People, and they were many, who did know him, stared at him with a still greater surprise, wondering what extraordinary event in his history was about to occur. Uncle Ith felt the additional embarrassment of fame, or notoriety, for an affidavit, prepared by Overtop, giving the full particulars of his observations from the bell tower, had been published in all the city papers that morning. Before noon, Uncle Ith had been waited on by 6 newspaper reporters, to whom he had furnished particulars of his early life, and had promised to sit for his photograph, for the use of an illustrated weekly on the following day. For all these reasons, added to his natural modesty, he pulled the door-bell with a feeling of profound regret, which was followed by a strange desire to run around the corner. Before this desire could have been gratified, the door was opened by a servant, and Uncle Ith was ushered in. The anticipated awkwardness of an introduction to old Van Quintem was prevented by the approach of that gentleman before his name was announced. "Welcome, welcome," said he, shaking him by the hand with Dutch fervor. "I know you from Bog's description, you see. Your statement in the morning papers has lifted a load from several hearts, I can tell you. Bog will be delighted to see you. He was beginning to be afraid you would not come. "Hallo, Bog!" said the good old gentleman, shouting up the stairs. "Here is Uncle Ith." The bridegroom bounded down the stairs with boyish impetuosity, looking so fine that Uncle Ith hardly knew him. It was difficult to realize that the ungainly, ignorant boy of a few years back had become this nice looking, graceful young gentleman. Thus readily does the rough diamond of a good heart and brain, under the guiding hands of ambition and love, take its polish from contact with the world and with society. "Dear Uncle Ith," said the bridegroom. "Happy to see you, Uncle Ith," exclaimed Fayette Overtop, who, with Marcus Wilkeson and Matthew Maltboy, had been drawn from the second floor at the mention of his name. Marcus had not before seen Uncle Ith, though he had been thinking of him all day. The publication of the old man's affidavit was an entire surprise to Marcus, Overtop and Maltboy having said nothing to him about it. Other people read the document with interest because it solved a mystery, but to Marcus it wore the profounder, vastly greater importance of clearing the last shadow of foul suspicion from his name. It may be unnecessary to say, that it also gave rise to learned and interesting but profitless discussions in several of the papers, upon the possibilities of perpetual motion, which lasted until the explosion of a steam boiler under the pavement turned every editor to the consideration of steam boilers, their nature and habits, the rights of owners and of the public, and the necessity of stringent legislation for the better management of those subterranean powers of good and evil. Upon being introduced to Uncle Ith, Marcus gave the old man's hand a warm pressure, but said nothing. But Uncle Ith saw in his eyes an expression of deepest gratitude, and he knew what it meant, for he had read the report of the inquest at Overtop's office, and there learned for the first time the unhappy connection of Marcus Wilkeson with the Minford affair. Maltboy, who, being one of the appointed groomsmen of the day, was in extraordinary spirits, was profuse in his congratulations to Uncle Ith, and insisted rather unnecessarily upon introducing him to the retired merchants and the bachelor bank president. They had all read his affidavit, and regarded him with undisguised interest. For a man who has always been a lamb in his shyness and self-depreciation, to find himself suddenly transformed into a lion is a cause of no little embarrassment. Uncle Ith was so much flustered by all these tokens of popularity, that he could not utter an articulate word, but only mumble and wipe his heated brow. He wished that the usages of society would permit him to take off his coat, as he did in the bell tower, and be comfortable. A few more guests arrived, mostly of the ancient order, and a little too much of one sort to please a lover of variety. The advent of Mr. Frump, with all his impulsive Occidental peculiarities of character fresh upon him, was a decided relief to the decorous company already assembled in the parlors. In less than 10 minutes he was on terms of offhand friendship with everybody, and was telling strange stories of Western adventure to a group of eager listeners. Old Van Quintem received all his guests with that simple cordiality which leaves no doubt of a sincere welcome. The common remark was, "How well you are looking, Mr. Van Quintem!" And it was very true. Few men at 70 could show a figure so straight, cheeks so smooth, and an eye so bright. The unavailing sorrow which tenanted his heart 2 years before had gradually disappeared. From the hour that his son fled, abashed, from his presence, he had not seen or heard of him, and had at last come to regard him as dead, though the old gentleman could not have given a good reason for that singular belief, except that his son had been a constant cause of sorrow and trouble to him when alive. He preferred to think of the lost son not as the ripened villain, but as the innocent child prattling upon its mother's knee. This mental picture filled a select chamber of the old man's memory, but the affection and reverential duty of a son had been supplied by the boy Bog, and in the virtuous character and filial love of that young man he saw what the innocent child might have grown to, had all his prayers and tears been answered. When old Van Quintem's wishes were consulted with regard to the wedding, he had but one favor to ask, and that was that the ceremony might take place at his house. It was a whimsical idea, he said, but he would like to see his old home gay once more, as it used to be years ago. "Besides," said he, "I am rheumatic, and might not be able to attend the wedding if held elsewhere." Mrs. Crull, when she first heard from the lips of the blushing Pet that Bog had proposed and been accepted, immediately outlined the plan of a wedding at her house, which should be something unprecedented in point of magnificence. The plan took shape as she thought of it, and she had already settled upon the number of invitations and the other principal arrangements, when old Van Quintem's wish was mentioned to her. The sacrifice was a great one, and Mrs. Crull would make it only on condition that she should superintend the preparations with the same freedom as at her own house. Old Van Quintem consented to this, only stipulating that he should pay all the bills; and for over a week before the wedding, Mrs. Crull, assisted by that most buxom and busy of women, Mrs. Frump, had taken tyrannical possession of the dwelling, and made such extraordinary transpositions of the carpets and pictures and other movable property, that old Van Quintem, on surveying the work of renovation, hardly recognized the house as his own. The only apartment that was not inwardly transformed by these female magicians was the library. To that he clung, conscious that both his services and his advice were of no value. The house was soon filled with guests, or rather appeared to be filled, for the whole number invited and present was only 40. But 40 people, moving about uneasily, and expecting something, looked like 100 or more. Among them were many whose only claim to an invitation was their friendship for the host, or Mrs. Crull, or the bride, and not any mental, moral, or physical excellence which entitles them to mention in this history. There were 2 rooms on the second floor, upon which the interest of loungers, male and female, was concentrated. In one waited the bridegroom, his groomsmen, Overtop and Maltboy, Marcus Wilkeson, and Wesley Tiffles. They were a happy party, and not at all frightened at the approaching nuptials. Bog, for such his friends always did, should, and will call him, could not have been happier, far from it, if he had held a scepter in each hand. Overtop was happy in the contemplation of his marriage with that most sensible of girls, Miss Pillbody, which was set down for the week following. The affair would have come off 6 months before, but for Miss Pillbody's illness, happening soon after her mother's death. In consequence of this illness, her select school had been given up, never to be revived. Poor Overtop did not know how much he loved her until he saw how near he came to losing her. She had completely recovered, was ruddy and pretty with new health, and was Pet's first bridesmaid. Overtop thought pleasantly of her, and combed back his intractable cowlick. Matthew Maltboy was happy because he had taken a serious fancy to Miss Trapper, the second bridesmaid, a charming but peculiar girl, and the particular juvenile friend of Mrs. Frump. Matthew had met this young lady 2 or 3 times, and had suffered sweetly from her black eyes. Marcus Wilkeson was happy in his contented bachelorhood, in the happiness of his niece, and of all around him, and in the clearing up of the Minford enigma. Wesley Tiffles was happy because happiness was his constitutional disposition, under all circumstances and in all weathers. The arrival of Uncle Ith was the only event that had drawn this good-natured party from their retreat, and those who watched for their reappearance were disappointed. In the other room, The bride had been dressing for several hours, and was still hard at it, under the immediate supervision of the indefatigable Mrs. Crull, Mrs. Frump, and the two bridesmaids. Only the favored few were admitted to this retreat of mysteries. But they were kindly communicative. They brought back minute reports of the appearance and condition of the bride elect, in the various stages of her enrobement and ornamentation; and there was not a woman in the house who did not, every 10 minutes, have the image of Helen Wilkeson stamped on her mind, as accurately as the changeful phases of an eclipse on the photographer's plate. At the soft, calm, mystic, love-making, marrying twilight hour, the bridal party took their stand near the southern end of the great double parlor. The 40 guests were grouped before them, an audience without seats. Pet was pale, and leaned for support on Bog's arm. He stood firm, erect, unblenching, with that instinct of physical strength which one feels when the woman that he loves hangs confidingly on his arm. Fayette Overtop, with his well-known dislike for conventionalism, was thinking how tedious all that formality was, and how much more sensible to be married by an alderman or justice of the peace, privately, in 2 minutes. Miss Pillbody did not agree with her future husband on this point, and was thinking, at that very moment, what a solemn thing marriage was, and with what ceremonious deliberation it ought to be entered upon. Matthew Maltboy had had great experience as a groomsman, and he speculated with perfect composure on this important question, whether the gentle tremor of Miss Trapper's hand was caused altogether by the fluttering novelty of her situation, or partly by the love-enkindling contact of their interlocked elbows. As the 6 took their chosen positions, and gazed at a particular pattern in the carpet, selected by them at a private rehearsal in the morning, they were the subject of mental comment by the 40 guests. The women, looking at the costly dress of the bride, pronounced her beautiful. The men, never noticing her dress, but observing her pale face and heavy eyes, were not vividly impressed with her loveliness. Bog was admired by all, and envied by none to whom his history was known. The old ladies took a mild maternal interest in him, because he was an orphan, and the young ladies thought extremely well of him, because he was a strong, gallant, handsome fellow. Overtop was regarded with curiosity as the reputed hero of the Slapman scandal. Matthew Maltboy was universally condemned as too fat, and, with that brief criticism, was dismissed. Miss Pillbody was pronounced a little proud, because she stood straight, with shoulders thrown back, which was her usual attitude. Miss Trapper was admitted to be a very modest and diffident creature, because she had a slight stoop in the back, which was chronic. Old Van Quintem stood near the wedding party, and recalled with fond minuteness the hour when one, about the same age as Pet, and resembling her in the freshness of her youthful beauty, had crowned him with happiness. Mrs. Crull was close by, and looked at the bride, whom she had dressed with the pride of an artist. Mrs. Frump stood next to her, and shared in the same sentiments. Marcus Wilkeson's appointed place was somewhere in the neighborhood of the bride, but he shrank away to the side of Uncle Ith, who also obstinately clung to the other end of the room. The venerable clergyman stepped into the centre of the small open space which had been left in front of the bridal party, and uttered a cough, at which signal the buzz of conversation ceased. The ceremony was very brief and simple, according to the ritual of the Dutch Church, and people were married by it before they knew it. The minister had received in advance a fee of unprecedented size, which was at that moment lying at the bottom of his wife's pocket, and which that good woman had already spent, in imagination, on a new bonnet for herself, a new hat for the minister, dresses for the girls, books for the boys, and playthings for the baby. If the dimensions of the fee had any effect whatever on the mind of the excellent minister, that effect was to hurry up the ceremony, and make the two one with the least possible delay. At last the magical binding words were spoken, and the husband, stooping proudly to the not averted face of his blushing wife, gave her the first kiss. And at the same instant a little band of musicians, with chosen instruments, secretly stationed in the library, of which the door was now thrown open, struck up Mendelssohn's Divine Wedding March. As its jubilant notes floated through the house, the round of congratulations commenced. Blessed Pet! What had she ever done, she thought, so far as giddy happiness would allow her to think, to merit all these kisses, of which her two shy uncles bestowed two, these benedictions, these tears, and, above all, the possession of this noble heart by her side, henceforth to be all her own. The exultant peals of the wedding march, that highest expression of triumphal love, but faintly interpreted her joy. The bridegroom received his full share of the universal good wishes. Everybody was pleased with his behavior, and the bachelor bank president, and other members of the old school of gentlemen, pronounced him a glorious young fellow, a refreshing contrast to the puny, cadaverous youth of the day, and altogether worthy to have flourished 30 years ago. The bridesmaids and groomsmen were not neglected either, and Miss Pillbody and Miss Trapper thought that the next best thing to getting married was to assist others in the operation. As for old Van Quintem, after kissing the bride and calling Bog his son, and giving both of them his blessing, he had retired from the room to hide the tears of happiness which not even 70 years of this hardening world could keep from his eyes. For the second time in 5 minutes, Amos Frump approached Matthew Maltboy, and shook hands with him. "Fat and jolly as ever," said he. From the first adjective Matthew recoiled, though he tried to justify the propriety of the second by a laugh. "And I like you, hang me if I don't," said Mr. Frump, with Californian bluntness, "because you're fat and jolly. But here's wifey, and I know she wants to say somethin' to you." "So I do," said Mrs. Frump. "My head was so full of business to day that I had quite forgotten it. But you must step aside with me," she added, looking significantly at Miss Trapper. Matthew stepped aside, and she placed her lips to his ear, and whispered, "What do you think of Miss Trapper?" "A very pretty girl," said Matthew. "So she is, and one of the best-hearted creatures that ever lived. A little singular in one respect, perhaps." "What is that?" "Oh, she speaks out her mind, that's all. But then you always know where to find her." "She has not spoken any of it to me, at all events," said Matthew. "I can't get her to talk." "That's because she's modest. Cultivate her, and you'll find her a splendid girl. Between you and me, I have recommended you to her, and depend upon it, she will meet you half-way." "All right," whispered Matthew, gratefully. Here the full voice of old Van Quintem announced dinner, for which the elderly ladies had been demurely waiting for some time. 2 by 2 the bridal party and the guests marched to the banquet, spread in the long, broad dining room, which was one of the best features of this sturdy, old-fashioned house. What the bill of fare was, what tunes the band played in the library, what kind things were said to the bride and bridegroom, what compliments were breathed into young female ears, and not rebuked, what vows of love were exchanged, what courteous remarks of the old school were made by the bachelor bank president, what ancient jokes were passed off by the wits of the party as new, what abominable conundrums were then and there honestly invented, What overwhelming confusion Uncle Ith experienced when he found himself seated next to a lady who talked loud at him, and how he wished himself at home 100 feet from the ground. What complete happiness was felt and expressed by everybody, but especially by old Van Quintem and Marcus Wilkeson. What improbable stories were told by Mr. Frump. What philosophical sayings uttered on the spur of the moment by Fayette Overtop. What slightly impertinent but always amiable remarks advanced by Wesley Tiffles. All this might be imagined with a slight mental effort, but not so Matthew Maltboy's new misfortune. Profiting by Mrs. Frump's friendly suggestion, Matthew had exhausted all his resources of conversation in an effort to interest Miss Trapper. She had listened, and had returned faultlessly proper replies, and had conducted herself so much like all the other young women that Matthew had ever met, that he was puzzled to guess in what respect her singularity consisted. He longed to see a piece of that mind which, according to Mrs. Frump, she was in the habit of exhibiting to people. He was soon gratified. Miss Trapper had remarked that, in a few days, she was going to visit her friends in Chemung County, and would probably remain there 3 months. It struck Matthew as the right time to make a point. "Then I shall not see you, Miss Trapper, during all that time," he said with a sigh. Miss Trapper leveled a sharp glance at him, and said, "I suppose not." The remark was tartly made, but Matthew had noticed that she habitually spoke quick and short. "Our acquaintance has thus far been very pleasant, Miss Trapper, at least on my side," whispered Matthew. "Must it stop here?" To which Miss Trapper replied, "I don't know." Though the observation was not encouraging, it was, on the other hand, not entirely forbidding. "Since we are to be separated for 3 months, Miss Trapper, might I solicit the great privilege of corresponding with you occasionally?" Miss Trapper's thin lips expelled 2 words like shot out of a gun. "What for?" "What for?" echoed the amazed Matthew. "Why, for the pleasure of exchanging our ideas, you know." "That would be a bore," said Miss Trapper. "I didn't understand you," said Matthew, distrusting his ears. "I said it would be a bore, returned Miss Trapper with painful distinctness. "I hate letter writing." "Oh, ah! Do you?" said Matthew feebly. "Perhaps you would like some pickled cauliflower, Miss Trapper?" "Thank you." Matthew handed the pickled cauliflower to her, and held his tongue, satisfied with what he had seen of Miss Trapper's singularity, and not at all anxious to receive a larger piece of her mind. "I am doomed to be a bachelor," thought Matthew, with a suppressed groan. But hope, which attends upon fat and lean men alike, whispered in his mind's ear, "Why not marry a woman as fat as yourself?" "A capital idea," thought Matthew; "and if there's no other way to find one, I'll advertise for her." Dinner was protracted to a length that seemed tedious to all but the representatives of the old school. When it did come to an end, the party adjourned to the parlors, where a reasonable time was devoted to conversation and flirtation. At length the musicians, having taken their wedding dinner in their apartment, and drank full bumpers which somehow never interfere with the accuracy of musical performances, to the health of the happy pair, struck up a quadrille, which was at once interpreted by the younger people as a signal for dancing. 2 sets were instantly formed, and rattled through with. The Lancers followed, and was liked so much that the musicians were called upon to repeat it 3 times. The sets had now increased to 4, filling the 2 parlors, and crowding the elderly people to the wall or the hallway. Then, luckily, old Van Quintem bethought himself of the old-fashioned contradance, as a contrivance for bringing his contemporaries on their legs. By an extraordinary piece of good fortune, the musicians had learned it, and played it at a silver wedding the week previous. As the familiar notes, not heard for years, saluted the ears of the bachelor bank president, he showed the animation of an old war horse at the sound of the trumpet. "Now is our time," said he. Moved by common impulse, the members of a past generation rose and took their places. Old Van Quintem, temporarily forgetting his rheumatism, led off, escorting Mrs. Crull. The bachelor bank president took charge of a widow, in whose breast he had revived feelings that flourished 20 years before. The retired merchants brought each other's wives upon the floor. Even Uncle Ith came out from his seclusion in a corner, where he had been listening to the sound of his own fire bell, rung by other hands that night, and felt that here, at least, he should make no blunders. The tall, talkative lady, from whom there seemed to be no escape, had fastened on him as a partner. The good clergyman was the only old or middle-aged gentleman who did not take his place in the set, and he looked on and laughed. The dance commenced, slow at first, then gradually faster. The younger people, when they came to understand the simple movement, fell into the chain couple after couple, until it extended into the hallway, and through it into the parlors again. Everybody was drawn in now, old and young, married and unmarried, the minister and his wife only excepted, and they marked the measure with their heels. Round and round, and faster went the chain, with its constantly changing links. The musicians, playing the same strains over and over again, became frenzied by the repetition, and doubled the time without knowing it. Legs that had entered slow and stately upon the interminable maze, became, without the knowledge or consent of their owners, nimble and gymnastical. It was a delightful peculiarity of this wonderful dance, that couples could withdraw without breaking up the figure. The bride and groom, acting upon this privilege, slipped out of the flying circle, and sought, unaccompanied, the solitude of the vine-covered piazza behind the house, there to commune for a moment upon their new-found happiness. The night was calm. A faint breeze from the south stirred up secret odors in the hearts of dew-covered flowers, and musically sighed through the leaves and vines. The heavens were dark, but unclouded, and, as the lips of the lovers met in one clinging kiss, the host of stars beamed down upon them, and proclaimed an eternity of love. End of Book 14, Chapter 3. Book 14, Chapter 4 of Round the Block by John Bell BOUTON. This recording is in the public domain. 5 years. 5 years are an eventful space in the history of blocks, as of men. Within that period, they may be burnt down, blown down, or torn down to make room for grander blocks. In quick-growing American cities, the average life of blocks is less than that of the human generation that tenants them. First wood, then brick, then brownstone or marble. These are the successive forms of block life, before anything like stability is reached. Marble is the only real type of the permanent in American architecture. Nobody pulls down marble. But 5 years had made little change in the exterior of our block. It was situated at a point in the city from which the ebb tide of fashion was slowly receding, and which the flood tide of trade had not yet touched. There was not a new house on the block, or an old one materially altered. A little paint, and a diligent application of broom and Croton water, had kept the block quite fresh and jaunty. On the south side, There were some slight external modifications, in the shape of oblong black signs fastened near basement doors, and bearing names of doctors. 10 of these signs had been added to the south side within 5 years. There were only 2 houses upon that side now, to which you could come amiss in pursuit of medical advice. One of these was old Van Quintem's. 5 years had passed over the old house and the old man lightly. Both had been made to last, and were well taken care of, and gave to them only a mellower and riper look. The old man's long white hair had not commenced falling out, and his cheeks still bloomed with a ruddiness that does not belong to second childhood. He could still read his dear old books, and carefully chosen new ones, without spectacles, though he often preferred to hear them read in a sweet, soft tone, by a dear girl whom he always called Pet, and who would sit for hours at the old man's feet, giving to the noble thoughts of poet, novelist, or philosopher, the added charm of a sympathetic voice. At such times, a fine fellow, who was still known as Bog, would look on and listen with rapt attention, and the happiest smile on his face. Sometimes these tranquil scenes would be pleasantly broken in upon, and the meaning of the author profitably obscured, by the entrance of a certain little Helen, whom the old man would kiss and call Grandpop's Sugar Plum, and Sweetie Peaty. Bog would then catch it up, and toss it aloft, all whirling with curls, laces, and blue ribbons, and would say, "Coogy wogy now, coogy wogy now, coogy wogy now," at each tossing; and the child, with the marvellous instinct of 18 months, would understand this mysterious dialect, and then would smile through large blue eyes that looked like its mother's. To this house Myndert Van Quintem, Jr., had never returned, and no authentic intelligence of him had ever come. Fayette Overtop, Esq., while on a professional visit to St. Paul, Minnesota, to settle a large land claim, had heard of a notorious Van Benton, who had kept a gambling house there several years, and was finally killed by a spendthrift whom he had cleaned out of his last cent one night. The best description which he could get of this man tallied precisely with that of Myndert Van Quintem, Jr. But Overtop, with that discretion which was continually enlarging his circle of paying practice, said nothing of this to the old gentleman. Among the reports that Overtop had heard of this Van Benton was one, that he had forged his father's signature to large amounts in New York City, and had fled to the West, and there changed his name to avoid the arrest and punishment which his father had promised him. Had the old gentleman been informed of this circumstance, he would at once have identified Van Benton as his son, for it was known to him alone that young Myndert had repeatedly forged his name, evidences of which had been found in the desk where Marcus Wilkeson had often seen the young man busily writing, evidences which the forger had accidentally omitted to burn, and that he had been induced to leave the city through fear that his father would give him up to justice at last. On the memorable night in the milliner's shop in Greenpoint, the young profligate had seen that his father was terribly in earnest, and had quailed in the presence of that outraged and indignant soul. The second house, not ornamented by a doctor's sign, on the south side of the block, was the old tenement building of which Mr. Minford had occupied the upper story 5 years before. The tenants had all been changed 2 or 3 times, but the Minford tragedy was still a current legend among them. Murders or strange homicides are fixtures of houses where they occur. Nothing obliterates their memory but tearing down the houses and building anew, which is the course of treatment that the proprietor was proposing to himself, in consequence of the steady depreciation of rents. Pet never passed that house, or dared to look at it even from a distance. Bachelor's Hall, on the north side of the block, was still occupied by the three original tenants, and they liked it so well that they had bought it, and owned it on the tontine plan, viz., that upon the death of one of the owners his share shall go to the survivors. 5 years had improved Marcus Wilkeson's relish for a good book, an after-dinner pipe, and a chat with a friend. It was plain to all his friends, even to those who were happiest in their wedded lives, that Marcus was a great deal better off single than married. His was the genial, monkish nature, which thrives best in celibacy. Every afternoon Marcus visited his white-haired neighbor opposite, and never forgot to take along a toy or some candy for his grandniece Helen. He brought these offerings in lieu of baby talk, which he could never master. This fact pointed him out, beyond all question, as a predestined old bachelor. The general supervision of the house was entrusted to Mrs. Overtop, and most sensibly did she manage it. Knowing that a bar of cast iron is more easily bent than the set habits of men of 25 and upward, she attempted no changes in the domestic regulations of the establishment. The three friends found that they had not only all of their old freedom, but a charming female voice to accompany them in their songs, and on the piano or guitar, and a capital fourth hand at whist, and a beautiful reader, and an ever-cheerful companion. "If I could find such a wife now," Marcus and Maltboy would say. "But you can't," Overtop would answer. "There's not another like her in this world." There was a little Fayette Overtop, Jr., 2 years old, a great pet of the bachelors, and the far-off husband of little Helen on the other side of the block. Matthew Maltboy weighed 220 pounds. As associate counsel of Overtop, he made an imposing show in court, which was not fully borne out by his legal attainments. He was always talking of matrimonial intentions, a sure sign that a man never will be married. His last rebuff from Miss Trapper, now the wife of a wealthy tanner and currier, had taught him to keep his flirtations within narrower limits, but he openly professed, and probably believed, that when he really wanted to marry, without joking, you know, he could take his pick from the wide and varied ranges of female society. He smoked incessantly like a martyr, to reduce his flesh, but no adipose matter ever vanished in that cloud of sacrifice. Mash, the cook, bestowed her honest hand and maiden heart upon Patching, the artist, who had first seen her at the station house, and there contracted an artistic admiration of her face and figure. She would have preferred a pirate, but Patching's enormous hat gave him a freebooterish appearance, which went far to reconcile her to him. She was really a pretty woman, much handsomer than some of the shadowy beauties Patching was wont to put on canvas, and she made him a good and faithful wife, and cooked better dinners for him, at a small expense, than he had ever eaten before, and sent him out into the world clean and tidy every morning. Patching affected to be ashamed of his wife, and snubbed her sometimes in the presence of other people, but everybody who knew the couple saw that he had the best of the bargain. Mrs. Patching still took her favorite weekly, and cried over the stories as copiously as ever. Mrs. Crull continued to be the dearest and best friend of Pet and Mrs. Overtop, and little Helen and little Fayette would never know the great debt of gratitude that they owed to that excellent lady. Whenever she called on Mrs. Overtop, she always began to be extremely circumspect in her pronunciation and grammar, from force of habit, but soon relapsed into those old errors which, happily, were of the head and not of the heart. Mrs. Crull made no mistakes in her affections. She was in mourning for Mr. Crull, and truly vowed that she would never marry again. Mrs. Slapman had ceased to live on the block, Mr. Slapman had basely defeated the benevolent decree of the law, by turning his property into ready cash and sailing for Europe. This deprived Mrs. S. of her alimony the second year after their separation, and compelled her to give up housekeeping and the pursuit of truth in New York. She was now living among a small colony of Jigbees, in an obscure village of Connecticut, the pride of her family, the envy of the neighbors, and the idol of two local poets and of the professor of a high school in an adjoining town, who has learned her history, and is now patiently waiting for Slapman to die before offering her his hand in marriage. Uncle Ith rang the great bell in the high tower for a number of years with perfect satisfaction to himself and to the firemen. He took a paper, and he read it, and he found its political arguments so powerful and so interesting, that he adopted them as his own, as many another man of greater pretensions has done, and he got into the bad habit of talking politics in a small way. It happened, not long after, that there was an election for mayor, and a mayor was chosen who held to a variety of politics quite the opposite of that which was so ably inculcated in Uncle Ith's favorite journal. About a month later, Uncle Ith turned to the political column of his paper, and there read that he had been turned out of office, and that one Schimmerflimming, a German politician of the ward, who had been of great service in compassing the election of the new mayor, had been appointed in his place. The fact was that Uncle Ith was highly acceptable to all parties as a no-party man, but when he turned politician, he made himself amenable to the harsh laws of political warfare, and became, as his paper phrased it, the hoary-headed victim of the unprincipled tyrant, who, with the cunning of the serpent and the vindictive ferocity of the hyena, weaves his spider's web of mischief in his dark corner of the city hall. Uncle Ith retired to private life with a snug property, patiently saved up and thoughtfully invested. But as Adam went on eating apples, notwithstanding the disaster which had come to him from that species of fruit, so Uncle Ith took his newspaper, and paid for it punctually, and devoured it daily to the last. While Uncle Ith fell by politics, Coroner Bullfast rose by it. A judicious distribution of money and liquors, a notoriety for street fights, a singular talent for profanity, and an unstinted adulation of the basest classes of the community, won for him in succession some of the best prizes of the municipal lottery. He has his small sunken eyes now fixed on one of the highest offices of the state, and it will take a strong combination to defeat a candidate backed by such powerful agencies and interests. Mr. and Mrs. Frump lived happily on their country property. Mr. Frump tried experiments in blackberry raising, which proved a success, and was, at last accounts, concentrating his talents on the development of a new strawberry seedling. Whenever he went to town, he made a point of carrying back Matthew Maltboy, for whom his regard was inexplicably strong, and nothing gave him greater pleasure than to see his wife gracefully mounted on the spirited filly, and Matthew, heavily astride of the sober gray, starting off for a morning's ride, while he stayed at home to push on the seedling. When Wesley Tiffles had spent $10,000 in elegant leisure, he arrived at the noble determination to salt down, as he called it, the remaining $10,000 in 10 different savings banks. He distributed it thus, in order that the failure of one of the banks might not ruin him. The interest of this money, drawn half yearly, furnished him with a basis for operations of a character requiring genius, pen, ink, and paper, rather than ready cash. Whenever Tiffles's resources ran short, as they did occasionally, he always borrowed, and paid on the next interest day. In this policy he was inflexible, and he flattered himself on the sternness of his self-denial. Among the schemes which failed to receive the cordial approbation of capitalists were the following: a process for extracting green paint from green leaves; ditto for making nutritious food from the direct combination of earth, air, and water; a plan, submitted to the unappreciating government of Naples, to extinguish the volcano of Vesuvius, by pumping water from the bay into its crater in consideration of the sum of 1,000,000 florins, and a monopoly of working the extinct volcano for lava. Wesley Tiffles, profiting, at a late day, by the lesson of the Cosmopolitan window fastener, finally invented and patented a striking improvement in an apple paring machine, and, at last accounts, was clenching a good bargain for the sale of his invention. End of Book 14, Chapter 4. End of Round the Block, by John Bell Bouton.